For the past 3 years, Lutus has reigned as the 66th emperor of the empire, even though ascending to the throne was never his intention. Prior to this, his father and older brother had ruled the empire for 15 years. But monster invasions and rampant corruption had claimed their lives on the battlefield, leaving the throne to Lutus. He was completely unfamiliar with politics and the country's affairs. Initially, the royal court intended to turn him into a puppet, but Lutus proved them wrong. He led the empire to many glorious victories, conquering great milestones. However, one day, the princes who hated Lutus spread false rumors, which quickly reached the ears of the people, causing them to turn against him. They gave him the nickname the Devil in human form. In this situation, the monsters loyal to Lutus are ready to protect him. He declared that humankind were fools for daring to point a sword at Master Lutus. The reason people called Lutus the Devil in human form, it was the imperial mark that he bore, a special mark reserved only for royalty. It allows the owner to control humans, dragons, and sacred mythical creatures. However, the entire royal court feared Lutus, especially because his imperial mark allowed him to control monsters. This fear was so great that Lutus was confined to the Academy of Magic. But this turned out to be an advantage for him. The longer he stayed there, the stronger his magic became, to the point where even high-level spells were no longer a challenge. Nevertheless, despite Lutus's many good deeds for the Empire, the discrimination stemming from his title of the Devil in human form remained, even after he became Emperor. Returning to the story, Lutus's monstrous minions are eager to fight against humanity to protect him, but Lutus considered them fools, because he knew that such an action would only lead to war. The Emperor's mark bestowed upon him absolute power, but when his subordinates disagreed, he was forced to use it to compel their obedience. To activate the mark, Lutus needs to say out her full name, but he forgot his name before he could say it, which made his subordinates breathe a sigh of relief. But Rune, a slime subordinate, mentioned Lutus's name. This angered the other subordinates because they didn't want Lutus to use the mark on them. When the mark is activated, Lutus ordered his subordinates to retreat to the mountains, and as soon as they obeyed, the master-servant relationship between them would end. Then, Lutus sat silently on the throne, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The people finally swarmed into the palace. One of them grabbed Lutus by the collar. They loudly accused him of plundering their taxes to enrich himself, while they suffered poverty and hardship. Lutus remained calm in this situation, telling the man that the accusations were untrue. To further convince him, he confidently told the man he was free to search the palace for treasure, as Lutus knew perfectly well that there was no treasure there at all. This man had lost his wife in a war 8 years ago during the reign of Lutus's brother, but he was completely unaware of it. He blamed Lutus for everything, believing that he was the one responsible for his wife's death. Lutus realized that he couldn't stop his father's rage, so he calmly said, "If killing him would bring him relief, then go ahead, because he understands his guilt." Without hesitation, the man drew his dagger and stabbed Lutus to death. In her final moments, Lutus realized that her life had actually been quite dull. If there is an afterlife, he hopes to live a freer life. The scene shifts to a small house in the suburbs, where Lutus woke up in the form of a newborn baby. He soon realized he had been reborn. The words of the monks about reincarnation, which he had previously disbelieved, now became the only plausible explanation. Lutus was born into a poor farming family, and coincidentally, the name Lutus from his previous life was also a very common name in this village. Over time, he gradually became familiar with the language of this land, but it was certainly not one of the languages he knew. Lutus was eager to learn more about this new world. So initially, he hoped to find some books to read. However, he quickly realized that the villagers here were illiterate. Just then, a villager hurriedly raised the alarm. The announcement stated that the village chief had just collapsed. Everyone immediately rushed to his room to inquire about the situation. Lutus used his situational analysis skills and discovered that the village chief only had a common cold. This made him wonder why they didn't use basic healing techniques to treat him. Unable to abandon the village chief, Lutus stepped forward, placed her hand on his chest, and used healing magic to bring down his fever. Witnessing this, the villagers were astonished and praised Lutus, as they never expected him to be able to use magic. It was then that Lutus realized why they were so impressive. That's because nobody in this village knows how to use magic. Looking back, he realized he had never seen them perform any magic. Even the simplest spells were incomprehensible. This made Lutus wonder if illiteracy would prevent them from learning magic. From that day on, Lutus began using her magic to do good, helping people. Thanks to this, he gradually regained his magical abilities. Over time, Lutus discovers that he can use most of the magic he learned in his previous life. However, he also needed to be careful because the amount of magical power in his body was currently only average. But this wasn't a big problem because Lutus knew that she could increase her magical power through training and practice. Curious about the time that has passed since my death, Lutus decided to visit the village chief, express their intention to leave this small village. The main reason was that he wanted to learn more about this new world by traveling and exploring. In his previous life, Lutus never had the freedom to explore as he wished, but in this new life, he is no longer bound by the shackles of duty. The village chief, while understanding Lutus's wishes, could not let him leave so easily. He offered two options. The first option is to become a soldier serving a lord, and secondly, to become an explorer. The prospect of becoming an explorer immediately sparked Lutus's interest. The village chief explained that being an adventurer meant he would still work under the lord, but would get to fight monsters, and the freedom to travel the world in the process. Although both options are very dangerous, without hesitation, Lutus quickly decided that she wanted to become an adventurer. The next day, he told his parents about his decision. Initially, they strongly opposed it, out of concern for his safety, but after Lutus's persistent pleading, they finally relented, allowing him to pursue his chosen path. That day also marked the moment Lutus officially became an adult. A few days later, Lutus prepared to leave the village to go to the nearest adventurers guild. The young man's parents saw him off, warning him not to be reckless and risk his life. Lutus set off breathing a sigh of relief, because now he is free to do whatever he wants. He decided to head straight to the city of Elpin, where the Explorers Guild was located. Before becoming a full-fledged explorer, Lutus needs to pass the council's test. Upon arriving, he looked around and realized that the weapons here were very similar to those he had seen in the old empire. However, the biggest problem Lutus faced at this moment was that he still couldn't read. While he was lost in thought, a receptionist at the club noticed him and asked if he would like to register as a member of the Adventurers Club. Lutus nodded in confirmation, and the employee explained that to become an adventurer, he needed to prove his ability to defeat the monster. Specifically, Lutus will have to carry a body part or weapon of a monster as proof. If the item is deemed valid, Lutus will officially become a member of the guild. Lutus thought the requirements for joining the Explorers Guild seemed quite easy, since if he wanted to, he only needed one of those items from the nearest market. However, he decided to choose the path of honesty. So, let's begin our journey into the forest to search for the monster. As she ventured deeper into the forest, Lutus realized that the relationship between humans and monsters remained unchanged. Monsters kill humans and humans kill monsters. In the past, Lutus only killed monsters when there was no other option. Now, as he continued to search the forest, he suddenly remembered that if his subordinates from his previous life were still with him, he could use their detection skills to find the monster. But since they were no longer there, Lutus had to rely on his eyesight, which made the search take longer than expected. Passing by a gloomy cave, Lutus sensed a faint, weak surge of magic emanating from within. Curious, he went inside and was quite disappointed when they discovered it was just a few green slimes writhing in the corner of the cave. Upon realizing that these slimes understood human language, Lutus thought she could negotiate with them. However, before the agreement could begin, Lutus was suddenly shocked when asked why slimes could speak the language of the Empire. One slime showed annoyance at the question, then proudly declared that it was a loyal servant of Master Lutus. Upon hearing this, Lutus immediately became certain that this slime was Rune, one of his loyal monster subordinates from a previous life. Rune began to panic, asking how Lutus knew that name. Lutus tries to convince Rune that she is her former owner. It's simply that I've been reborn in a new body. Rune didn't believe it, so Lutus used her projection skill to directly transfer his memories into Rune's mind. When she realized Lutus was actually her former owner, Rune immediately jumped into his arms, expressing her joy and the intense longing she felt after centuries of separation. After a conversation aimed at rekindling their old connection, Lutus learned that approximately 1,000 years had passed since his death. Rune recounted that after Lutus's death, the other monsters traveled through the mountains and held a meeting to decide on their next move. However, they were unable to reach an agreement. So they eventually parted ways, each going their separate ways. Since then, Rune has chosen to avoid humanity and live in seclusion to survive, while also gathering more allies. This explains why it's here in the form of a slime. Lutus also understands that slimes are immortal unless directly attacked, which explains why Rune has been able to survive for millennia. After clearing up all misunderstandings, Rune realized Lutus was trying to prove her monster hunting abilities, so she suggested that Lutus provide a part of her body as proof, since slime bodies have the ability to regenerate very quickly. Even so, Lutus carefully used healing spells on Rune to speed up the regeneration process. When it was time to return to the Explorers Guild, Lutus packed her bags and said goodbye. But before he left, Rune called after him. Lutus asked her to make her his subordinate once more. The offer left Lutus speechless, because he hadn't expected this at all. Although feeling guilty for abandoning Rune and the other subordinates, Lutus was still worried about her current situation. He was just a humble farmer who lost everything, including the Imperial Seal. Lutus held out her palm as proof, showing Rune that the Emperor's mark had disappeared. But surprisingly, the mark was still there, clearly visible on his hand. Lutus didn't think this was just a coincidence. He saw it as a reminder that he needed to atone for his past mistakes and correct them. With that in mind, Lutus decided to make a contract with Rune. He officially made her his subordinate once again. However, on the way back to the Explorers Guild, Lutus began to worry about bringing Rune along, because if you're caught carrying a slime, it will attract unwanted attention. Rune understood the situation and immediately transformed, turning into a beautiful young woman. Lutus was astonished to realize that this figure was exactly like Cecile, a former classmate of his from the academy in a previous life. Rune accomplished this by using his special skill, disguise, which helps conceal the form of a creature or object. This skill only lasted for a short time, but Rune mastered it to near perfection. She copied Cecile's appearance so accurately that it was indistinguishable from the real person. Cecile is the daughter of the Grand Duke, whom Lutus secretly loves. But now she is no longer alive, and Lutus felt uncomfortable that Rune had copied her body again. Rune sensed Lutus's unease and immediately apologized, explaining that it was much easier to replicate the appearance of someone who had died 1,000 years ago. After explaining, Rune said it was time for them to leave, but addressed Lutus as master. Lutus corrected him, telling Rune to just call him by his name. As they set off, Rune questioned Lutus's decision to become an adventurer, as it seemed quite unexpected. Lutus explained that it was his only choice, as he wanted the freedom to travel the world. However, Lutus worried about the possibility of encountering his monster minions, who were still alive, especially since he wasn't sure if they would forgive him for abandoning them. Rune comforted Lutus, telling her not to worry about it, because she wouldn't forgive anyone who didn't understand Lutus's reasons. Lutus appreciated Rune's sympathy, but he knew things wouldn't be that simple. Moving forward, he saw a carriage with a broken wheel being attacked by goblins. Observed more closely, Lutus realized that the soldiers were no longer strong enough to fight off the goblins. And if things continue like this, they won't be able to last much longer. Therefore, Lutus decided to wipe out all the goblins. Although he didn't want to draw too much attention to himself, this was an unavoidable situation and he couldn't ignore it. The strategist targeted the unarmored goblins first, then used Thunder Whip to attack the goblins who are using bows and arrows. The goblins showed no sign of giving up. Therefore, Lutus was forced to burn their leader to death. This terrified the remaining goblins and began to flee. When they were ordered to retreat, Lutus realized they were speaking the language of the Empire. This made him wonder how they could have survived until now. Initially, he thought about chasing after them, but then, remembering he was just a novice explorer, he decided to let them go. Meanwhile, the soldiers drew the attention of all the surrounding adventurers as the princess had lost consciousness. Lutus approached the princess. He used his magic to diagnose her condition and realized that she had been afflicted with a poisonous curse. Upon hearing this, the soldiers immediately panicked. Lutus realized that this was a very dangerous situation, because if we don't act quickly, the princess will die within 5 minutes. The carriage broke down. That means there's no way to save the girl. The only option was for Lutus to use purification, a highly advanced medical technique that is very difficult to master. He knew this might attract attention, but he couldn't let the girl die, so he had no other choice. He asked everyone to step back as he was about to use a temporary first aid spell to save her. Lutus completed her treatment, and the soldiers were relieved to see her beginning to regain consciousness. However, this was only temporary first aid, so Lutus urgently requested the knights to take her to a doctor immediately. Lutus realized she had made a smart decision, as this action wouldn't draw his attention to her, now that the treatment was almost complete. The knights were extremely grateful and appreciative, making Lutus sweat as he instructed them not to pay too much attention to him. However, the princess's condition continued to worsen. Therefore, Lutus suggested they take her back to the city for prompt medical attention. After rescuing the princess and ensuring she received adequate medical care, Lutus secretly left, believing she would be all right. As they prepared to return to the expedition, he was stopped by Rune, who apologized for making Lutus wait so long. Lutus informs Rune that he plans to join the expedition, and now that she has a human form, she can join as well. Upon arriving at the expedition, they discovered that to register, they needed a letter of recommendation from the village chief. Rune realized they lacked the necessary documents, so she suggested they just fake it. They thought no one would find out. With that idea in mind, they approached the reception desk, presented the slime body part, and 2 fake letters of introduction. When the receptionist checked the letters, Rune and Lutus were understandably worried, fearing that she would discover the deception. However, when the receptionist reached into her pocket and saw a green slime, she was surprised because this type of slime is extremely rare. Lutus breathed a sigh of relief when the receptionist approved her and presented them with official explorer badges. With their joining the expedition guild complete, Lutus and Rune officially became explorers of the guild. Then the expedition guide explained the duties and rights of an explorer. First, explorers can use any of the guild's facilities across the continent, which suits Lutus perfectly as it's something he's always wanted. At the same time, they also have a duty to eliminate the monsters, but Lutus thinks this shouldn't be too difficult to accomplish. Finally, the expedition had a hierarchical system. The title of each explorer is determined. If an explorer meets the criteria of the guild, they will be called by titles such as warrior, hunter, or mage. Lutus and Rune will be taking an exam to determine their rank. Lutus returned home, lying in bed feeling tired. He wasn't doing anything too strenuous, but perhaps it was because he hadn't fought in 15 years. He decided to go to bed early today. At that moment, Rune jumped onto Lutus, asking him for a massage, while submerging him in a watermelon. This surprised Lutus, and he yelled at her to get down immediately. Rune, with teary eyes, she returned to her slime form and said she felt ashamed of her actions. Seeing her sad expression, Lutus realized he had been a little harsh, so he apologized to her. Meanwhile, he suddenly realized it had been over 1,000 years since they last met, and Rune was probably too emotional about it. Lutus knelt down, caressed her, and reminded her how happy he was to see her again. This brightened Rune's mood. That evening, they both talked about the upcoming exams. Lutus asked Rune to restrain his power, using only basic skills to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. As for himself, he was no longer as strong as before, so he had no difficulty adapting to his new life. However, he realized one thing: limiting his power was difficult. Using magic in real battle is easier because he can freely display his power. But trying not to attract attention wasn't easy at all. Even if he wanted to join the mage class, he still had to avoid using advanced magic. Lutus asked Rune which class she was aiming for, and she replied that it was the warrior class, because she preferred close combat fighting and wasn't good at magic. Nevertheless, Lutus decided to buy her a suit of armor and weapons, so she could fight better. Although it would cost quite a bit of money, but since they're going to become adventurers, getting that money back won't be too difficult. Lutus enjoyed this moment because he could finally do what he wanted. Then they promised not to back down. We are committed to conquering new challenges together. However, Lutus still had a lot to think about. Their main goal was to earn money and buy a place to live. Then he will take the time to find his subordinates again. The next morning, they went to the Explorers Guild. They were introduced to Nor, who was in charge of ranking them in their aptitude test. Nor congratulated them on becoming official adventurers and announced that it was time to begin the test. She asked Lutus to go first. I asked him if he could use magic. Lutus replied reluctantly, implying that he lacked confidence in his magical abilities. He tried not to attract attention, so he decided to use only basic magic and minimize their power as much as possible. The first test involved healing techniques. Therefore, Nor asked Lutus to restore her magical energy using a basic healing technique. This wasn't difficult for Lutus, as the required magic was extremely basic. Lutus performed magic, but Nor's eyes widened in surprise when he saw that the man had used magic without a spell. Lutus, bewildered by Nor's reaction, looked at her and explained that he knew nothing about it, as he was just an ordinary farmer. Mages of the old empire could cast spells without incantations, but now only descendants of the empire can do so. This led Nor to believe that Lutus was a descendant of the empire, and from that she became convinced that Lutus was qualified to become a mage. Meanwhile, Lutus bowed her head, realizing that differences in the use of magic had begun to become apparent. The next round is about offensive magic. Lutus couldn't afford to reveal any further suspicion, so he told Nor that he would only use one basic attack, a fireball. Realizing that this spell was too simple, Lutus just needs to adjust her magical power. He manipulated magic and used it to destroy his targets without attracting attention. Nor intended to extinguish the fire, using his hydro-based techniques to put it out. But surprisingly, the fire didn't go out. Lutus looked back surprised, realizing that the fireball he had just conjured was an upgraded version used by the military, meaning only a large amount of magic could extinguish it. Lutus thought to himself that Nor must be incredibly strong to withstand this magic. He wondered if anyone was powerful enough to extinguish his fireball. In a moment of panic, Nor realized it would be embarrassing if he couldn't put out the fire. She decided to try one more time using her water-based techniques, hoping to extinguish the fire. Lutus, realizing her power was still insufficient, he then used his magic to enhance her power. Before the magic could be cast, everything happened so quickly, and Nor was surprised that the fire was finally extinguished. At the end of the test, Nor realized she was too tired to put out the fire immediately. Based on the test results, she concluded that Lutus's abilities qualified her to become a witch apprentice, and it even promoted him to a higher rank, making him an official wizard. Lutus heard this, bowed his head, and thanked her deeply. I breathed a sigh of relief because everything had gone smoothly. Now it's Rune's turn to check. Throughout the test, Rune used spells and reduced his magical power to its lowest level. She completed the exam with flying colors, become a member of the guild, and received the rank of apprentice warrior. The next day, the two began their new lives as adventurers. They headed to the bulletin board, eager to find a quest, but all I saw were tedious tasks like fighting goblins. Just then, Eris, a hunter, called them over, asking if they were new recruits. After the introduction, Eris told Lutus that she didn't sense any intimidating aura from him, despite rumors that he had been promoted to wizard. At this point, Eris was slightly surprised by Lutus's request, as there were many goblins around here. Goblins often attack human cities and hide in forests, making them even more difficult to find since they establish bases deep within the woods. Lutus listened to the explanation and realized that goblin attacks on major cities were the reason many quests involved fighting goblins. But not many hunters accepted the offer because the reward from the feudal lords was too low. A dell was only equivalent to a full glass of beer, and each goblin killed would only yield the hunter one dell, a paltry sum, making the quest almost worthless. Nevertheless, Lutus decided to accept the mission to fight the goblins, because he had a vague feeling upon hearing that the goblins here could speak the language of the Empire. He suspected this might be the work of one of his former subordinates, and he wanted to find out more. So, Lutus officially received her first mission, fighting goblins along with Rune. Lutus and Rune begin their first mission as hunters, heading north to Elpin to engage in battle with goblins. As they walked, Rune playfully asked Lutus what she thought of her armor. Lutus blushed and replied that it was just a breastplate, so she shouldn't expect too much. This breastplate is old, has been used by the military, and is no longer in service. But strangely enough, when Rune wore it, it looked elegant and dignified in Lutus's eyes. Ignoring that, Lutus asked Rune if she knew anything about goblins being able to speak the language of the Empire. Goblins speaking the Imperial language weren't uncommon, but Rune suspected they were descendants of the Empire. There are also goblins among Lutus's subordinates, and if they are present here, Lutus can order them to leave Elpin. However, the major problem is that goblins view humans as food, forcing them to resort to violence. Soon after, the goblins appeared, staring at them with eyes full of hatred. Lutus didn't want to fight, he only wanted to negotiate, so he asked them to call their leader. However, the goblins were unwilling to negotiate because they were showing disrespect to Lutus. To protect his master, Rune had no choice but to annihilate the first wave of goblin attacks. This terrified the remaining goblins. Lutus wanted to keep the goblins alive for questioning, but he accidentally killed them. Realizing his actual fighting skills were terrible, Lutus tried to communicate with the remaining goblin, but it refused to negotiate. So Rune stabbed it through the chest. She warned it never to harm its owner. This bloody battle made Lutus realize that negotiation was impossible unless he could speak to their leader. After thanking Rune for protecting him, she blushed and said that she liked receiving compliments from her master. Before leaving, one of the goblins whispered its last breath. Save him, Master Bates. The next day, they returned to guild adventurers. They were planning to claim their reward for the 50 goblins they had brought back. When they arrived at the reception desk, the receptionist was astonished to see that they had defeated so many goblins. He shouted in utter astonishment. Lutus had killed that many goblins, but that was the only information he had. That's the name of Bates, the supreme leader of the goblins. Bates was once one of his subordinates who had sworn allegiance to him out of a burning desire to study magic. Logically, Bates should have died long ago. However, Lutus realized that perhaps a life-extending magic had been developed. Although Bates may command attacks against others, he wouldn't kill someone without a justifiable reason. It's also possible they're just coincidental names. While Lutus was lost in thought, Eris, a colleague, approached and congratulated them on their first assignment. She had heard many stories about new recruits but had never seen anyone do something so impressive. Brought back 50 goblin eyes. Eris remembered the first time she only caught 3 goblins. This made her realize the superior power of Lutus and Rune. Lutus sensed that this situation was not good, as all the attention was focused on her. People started asking him for advice on how he managed to do it, and he explained that it was like hunting wild boars. Lure them into a trap and then kill them. Eris didn't believe it because she knew goblins weren't that stupid. Lutus forced a smile, trying to convince Eris, then explained that Rune had acted as bait, making the plan more convincing. At this point, Ashura, another explorer, stood up and began to boast. It is said that in his first mission he was called Great Ashura, who slayed goblins for the people. However, Eris knew Ashura's history well, so she didn't hesitate to expose the truth, saying that he was so weak he couldn't even defeat a goblin and had to return to seek help. Putting that aside, everyone decided to throw a party to celebrate the success of Lutus and Rune's first mission. Suddenly, Eris crept closer to Rune and grabbed her watermelon, and told her to eat more so they could grow even bigger. After completing their first task, they continued the party with laughter, drinks, and delicious food. Having become true adventurers, they participate in the Goblin skirmish mission alongside their seniors Eris and Castle. Both Eris and Castle proved their strength, defeating a wave of goblins without the help of Lutus and Rune. Lutus didn't participate in this mission because of the reward. Instead, it was to observe Nor's magical power. Nor has reached the highest rank of adventurers, and Lutus hopes to learn more about her magic. Over time, Lutus realized that the level of magic in this era had declined considerably. None of them, including Nor, could use intermediate magic, let alone advanced magic. However, Nor is capable of using a wide range of spells, leading Lutus to believe she has untapped potential. Eris realized that Lutus had been staring at Nor for a while now, convincing herself that he had feelings for Nor. Upon arriving at the next city, Castle and Eris announced that they had business to attend to, and told Lutus and Nor to return to ILD after some time. Before leaving, Eris waved goodbye to them, then winked at Lutus, saying she would create a private room for them to study in. Lutus stood there dumbfounded, feeling confused, realizing there might have been some misunderstanding. Lutus and Nor strolled around the city, and he realized this was a good opportunity to ask her about the secrets to improving his magical skills. But he didn't know where to begin. They happened to pass by a giant statue that Lutus found very familiar. He discovered that he and the statue shared the same name, but thought it was just a coincidence. Nor explained the history of the statue, making Lutus realize that it was erected to commemorate his former emperor. Legend says he mastered all kinds of magic, won every battle, and destroyed evil forces. However, Lutus knew that this story was quite far from the truth. Nor shared that the person who built this statue is rumored to be the emperor's assassin. Lutus, his face glistening with sweat, couldn't believe it, because the person who had killed him hated him to the core. Surprisingly, Lutus discovered that 500 years after his death, all of his actions as emperor were justified. Therefore, a statue was erected to commemorate him. After the collapse of the empire, the world was devastated. Therefore, people began to worship the statue, turning Lutus into a famous god in the present world. They prayed for the return of the Holy Emperor, and the statue was a symbol of that. Still in a state of shock, Lutus realized that no matter how dilapidated the world might be, all they desired was the restoration of humanity. That evening, Lutus returned home to meet Rune, who was excited about his master's return. With their combined income, they rented a room long-term. They also summoned some more tiny slimes from the cave with Rune's help. These slimes have mastered the basics, and they might even use camouflage techniques to transform themselves into humans for a day. Their presence has been a great help to Lutus, as his strength and magic have been enhanced since their arrival. When slimes have the ability to camouflage themselves, Lutus wanted them to try it right away, but he didn't know who to transform into. Disguising himself as anyone around him was a terrible idea, so he decided to take the form of someone he knew from a previous life. Rune suggested that they could transform into Selene, his blue-haired classmate from a past life. Then a slime transformed into Selene, much to Lutus' surprise. And he realized he had to name this slime girl. After a moment of thought, he decided to call her Marina, a beautiful girl with hair as blue as clear water. Meanwhile, Lutus knew that Rune understood him well, but what he didn't understand was why she cared so much about romantic relationships. Marina is very honored to receive the name from Lutus. Rune suggested they do the same with the remaining slimes, although the accuracy might not be as high. At that moment, Eris burst into their room, demanding they come to the guild immediately. Along the way, Lutus noticed that Eris seemed unusual, as she didn't look like herself. Upon arriving at the guild, they found the guildmaster making an announcement that the Beijing Towers reported seeing an army of goblins moving toward Elpin. This announcement helped Lutus realize that the goblins in the forest were actually just pawns. The guildmaster suggested everyone prepare for a goblin raid outside the city, a preemptive strike aimed at halting their advance. Adventurers will participate directly on the front lines and are required to be well prepared. Lutus wondered what the Grand Duke was thinking, as this strategy was completely illogical. Even though goblins were enemies, organizing such an attack was reckless. The Grand Duke ordered that while preparations for the preemptive strike were underway, the adventurers would be responsible for defending the city walls. But they paid little attention to defensive walls and focused solely on launching a preemptive attack, making Lutus realize they were being overly confident in this strategy. 1,000 goblins faced 600 soldiers from Elpin. On the day of the raid, the army's formation was quickly broken, as the cavalry advanced too far, while the goblins held their ground despite their limited abilities. Lutus and Rune observed from a distance, realizing that the situation could become very bad if it continued like this. The reason the cavalry advanced so far was because they greatly underestimated the goblins. In a one-on-one fight, it might be possible to overwhelm the goblins, but with their current disorganized formation, dealing with their counterattack will be extremely difficult. Lutus looked around and was surprised to see the princess he had rescued before was present. Putting that aside, he noticed the goblins' formation. It was the tactical formation of the old empire. With this formation, they could attack directly into the center of the enemy's ranks. Furthermore, the cavalry had advanced too far and couldn't return to provide support, making the situation even more perilous. Seeing the goblins moving in perfect unison and with such precision, Lutus had no doubt this was definitely the Empire's tactic. He knew this battle was about to become extremely fierce. Meanwhile, the Queen questioned the soldiers about the commander's position. When they learned that he was in a brothel instead of on the battlefield, the princess was extremely angry and ordered the soldiers to take her there immediately. Lutus observed the princess's firm and confident demeanor and understood that she was not someone to be underestimated. Shortly afterward, the battle officially began. Unexpectedly, the enemy's formation collapsed. This left Lutus bewildered, wondering if his initial judgments were wrong. If things continued as they were, his forces could very well win. However, this made Lutus reconsider the name Bates that the goblins had mentioned. Perhaps it wasn't someone he knew, because if it were, things would have unfolded completely differently. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind swept through, startling and panicking the soldiers. Nor collapsed, his eyes filled with despair, muttering that this was the end. Eris tried to calm her, but Nor continued her panic, saying that the wind was a sign of a legendary spell. The Firestorm, a destructive spell capable of wiping out thousands of soldiers in the blink of an eye. Upon hearing this, Lutus immediately realized that this wind was a type of high-level magic that had existed in his era. Back then, only mages with immense magical power could use this kind of magic, but now it had reappeared, demonstrating its extraordinary, terrifying, and dangerous nature. Not wanting to let fear spread within the team, Lutus quickly cast the tranquility spell on Nor. This lulled her to sleep. He bowed his head in apology, saying he couldn't let her panic affect the morale of the others. Then, Lutus ordered Rune to summon all the slimes because the time for battle had come. When he sliced a goblin in half, Lutus realized that the front line had long since collapsed. Saving the entire army was almost impossible. The only remaining option was to attack the enemy base directly. The aim was to disrupt their formation. Lutus knew there were only two types of magic suitable for this strategy without being detected. Stealth magic, completely concealing sound and the source of magical energy. Invisibility magic, only concealing the presence of the caster. However, the invisibility spell consumes too much magic power, making it impossible to use simultaneously with the invisibility spell. Therefore, Lutus decided that Rune and the slimes would disguise themselves in cloaks. He calculated that with this strategy they could approach the enemy base without being detected. However, their magical energy was depleted very quickly during their journey. Lutus was certain that all of this was part of Bates' plan, who seemed to have anticipated their every move. Upon arriving at the goblin base, Lutus successfully approached their leader and frankly requested a conversation. Not wanting to waste time, Lutus declared that he was the emperor whom Bates had once served. But Bates didn't believe him and ordered his men to attack Lutus. Cornered with no other option, Lutus used lightning, unleashing a thunderous attack that annihilated all of Bates's subordinates in an instant. Bates stood stunned, observing the situation. However, Lutus was even more astonished to realize that they were completely unaware of the attack he had just used. This made him realize that this wasn't the Bates he knew 1,000 years ago. After some conversation, Lutus discovered that the leader of these goblins was the 18th Bates, and all the goblins here are descendants of the original Bates. One of them will bear the title of Bates. This explains why they can speak the language of the Empire. Lutus concluded that they had learned the firestorm technique from the original Bates. However, they were astonished as to how he knew about it in the first place. Their high-level magic was actually only average compared to Lutus. So he told them to keep training so that one day they could use higher-level magic. However, Bates didn't believe he could ever master high-level magic, even if he dedicated his entire life to it. He thought he couldn't achieve it right now, but perhaps in 1,000 years the next generation would be able to. Lutus heard this. He immediately burst into loud laughter. He believed Bates could do it, so he proposed a deal. If Bates ended the war and became his subordinate, Lutus will teach him advanced magic and share all of their knowledge. This offended Bates, and he ordered his men to kill Lutus. But as expected, Bates's henchmen were no match for Lutus. Lutus realized that Bates was now much weaker than before, as he didn't even know about reflection magic. After killing Bates, Rune informs Lutus that the fire he started is spreading, and at this point he uses a high-level spell, water spray, to extinguish the flames. Nor witnessed this scene and realized that this was high-level magic. This made her think that Emperor Lutus had returned. With the goblins defeated, Lutus decided to return. Goblins naturally harbor a deep-seated hatred for humans, and humankind is no different, because for thousands of years humans have been exterminating goblins. But before leaving, Lutus witnessed one of the remaining goblins bow before him, swearing allegiance. He said he wanted to become Lutus's subordinate and learn magic after defeating Bates. The goblins' formation quickly collapsed. Lutus accepted the goblins' request using the invisibility and concealment spells to return to Elpin. Upon returning to the guild, everyone celebrated the victory. Let Lutus drink as much as she wants. However, people began to notice that Nor was missing. They speculated that she might be in the town square seeking some fresh air. Nor was still in shock after witnessing the enemy's magic, so they decided to wait for her until she calmed down. However, Castle believes this is something much deeper than that. She seemed afraid of something, as if it reminded her of something. Upon reflection, they realized something strange. The magic the goblins had used had vanished without a trace. Some priests even claimed that the forbidden magic was divine judgment. Rune was drunk at the time, and she revealed Lutus's true potential, but no one believed her because of her intoxicated state. Lutus calmly comforted her and helped her to bed, confident she would be all right because he knew she had drunk a lot of water. Marina came up behind him and said he should rest a little after everything he had done. Then he apologized to Bates for what happened. Although he had become Lutus's subordinate and promised to persuade the other goblins to obey, but there's still one problem: accommodation. Rune and Marina could stay in this room, while Lutus and the other goblins would stay in another. But the need for accommodation increased as the number of subordinates grew. Goblins cannot live in nearby urban and rural areas, so building a remote dwelling is crucial. Seeing how tired Lutus was, Marina suggested he rest for a day and continue the next day. He lay down to rest next to Rune, who had fallen asleep some time ago. A moment later, Rune woke up to find her clothes were gone. Lutus's chest was pressed against her body, giving her a feeling of warmth and softness. After a while, Lutus regained her composure and ordered Rune to put his clothes back on immediately. Just then, a group of guards burst into the room, demanding that Lutus follow them. Rune thought Lutus had been kidnapped, immediately jumped out of bed and attacked them. Lutus reassured her that he hadn't done anything wrong and was just conducting an interrogation. He told her not to worry and then followed them to see what they wanted. Lutus arrived at a magnificent palace where he met Rostin. The princess's guardian said that he had a hard time finding Lutus because he had left without revealing his name. The princess had summoned him, and so he respected the invitation and entered her room. When Lutus arrived, he observed the princess and realized she was so beautiful that even the princesses and nobles of the empire could hardly compare. After Lutus greeted the princess, she bluntly asked him how he had treated her earlier, her expression serious. Lutus guessed that she would call him over for this reason. He thought she must be very knowledgeable about magic, so she would be able to tell if he was lying. He considered altering her memories, but with his current magical abilities, he couldn't do that. Therefore, his only option was to deceive her. He said it was a kind of inherited magic in his village that could cure many kinds of poisons. Surprisingly, she believed this explanation and said that was exactly what she had expected. When she was poisoned, the princess tried an antidote, but it didn't work, and she subsequently fainted. Knowing that this type of poison could only be neutralized by the skill Lutus had mentioned, Purge, Lutus heard this and realized he had done the right thing by not lying about magic. Deciding to feign ignorance, he said it was just a type of magic inherited from his village. Although his story about his village wasn't entirely convincing, he hoped she wouldn't find any flaws in it. The princess announced that she had summoned him to express her gratitude for his timely arrival. Then she started throwing out a series of questions, asking him how he acquired this magic, making Lutus realize he had just put himself in another difficult situation. He had to invent a new story to tell her. He said he had sneaked into a forbidden area in the village where he learned healing magic by reading a magic book. She asked to see the book, but he replied that he had burned it. He thought she would give up, but no. She asked him to teach her that magic. Lutus had to admit that she was truly persistent. Lutus couldn't understand why a royal princess like herself would be interested in learning healing magic. To explain, the princess pulled off her glove, revealing the emperor's mark, identical to the one on Lutus's hand. The royal families of this continent were often granted the king's insignia, allowing them to associate with servants. And without a doubt, the mark that Lutus knew was the five-pointed emperor's mark. The royal family is descended from noble lineages within the empire, which means it's not surprising that they inherit the imperial insignia. However, the princess considered it useless because she didn't know how to use it. In the past, the royal family held a ceremony where they performed pact rituals with selected servants. While her brother easily performed this ritual, she was unable to do so. Since then, she has been ridiculed, and so she has always tried her best to find a solution, studying magic. This five-pointed star allows you to create a pact with monsters, but it's quite ineffective when used against monsters. Those who can use high-level magic are rare. Therefore, she thought that if she could learn Lutus's healing skills, it would greatly benefit the kingdom in many ways. She expressed her dissatisfaction with the current situation. The princess boldly requested that Lutus become her servant, with a salary of 50 del per month. The salary she offered was so low that Lutus could earn that much in a single day. However, no matter how much she offered, Lutus refused to become her servant because he was aware of the dangers of getting involved in the power struggle. In response, Lutus suggested that she should stop using magic if she felt compelled to do so. Being born into the Toil family and becoming a marker was a challenge for her, but she still considers it a gift from the gods. She doesn't dislike the five-pointed star symbol because it reminds her of Emperor Lutus. And the only thing she wished for was to become a great person like him. Lutus listened and burst out laughing. This made the princess feel a little embarrassed. He didn't want to become her servant, but he agreed to be her tutor until she learned the magic skill, for a salary of 2 del per day. Hearing this, the princess's face lit up with a smile, her expression full of excitement. After hearing what she said, Lutus saw her as a person of strong will, and didn't think she would do anything bad with magic. The 2 del per day wage he proposed wasn't very high, just enough to support his servants. When Lutus returned home that day, Marina approached her and said that she wanted to become an adventurer. Lutus was taken aback by Marina's sudden decision. She explained that she wanted to be able to help him, just like Rune had done. However, Lutus didn't think she was ready. He believed she would only cause trouble instead of helping. Because she lacked interpersonal skills and basic understanding, Lutus worried that Marina would make a big mistake, but perhaps he had been a little too harsh. So, he decided to invite Marina to join him in gathering herbs. She would have the opportunity to face monsters and prove her abilities as an adventurer. Marina was incredibly excited, but Rune wasn't happy about it at all. Soon after, they set out and encountered a type of herb used to make an antidote. However, this herb had several similar plants that could be poisonous. Small-leaved plants are used as medicinal herbs, while plants with large leaves are poisonous. Lutus challenged Marina by asking her questions about it, but she couldn't answer, which dampened her confidence. Rune suggested Marina should go home, but Lutus felt she needed to experience more things to gain more knowledge. He believes that failure is part of the learning process, and the most important thing is to have the courage to face the challenge. At that moment, Marina was suspended in mid-air by a trap plant called Rafflesia. However, surprisingly, she burst out laughing instead of being scared. Rune quickly used a fireball to burn the vines. But be careful to save the nectar of the plant because it is highly valuable. Then Rune scolded Marina for putting herself in danger. But Lutus told her not to worry because he had also made a mistake. He glanced over and discovered some magical ore. It can be sold at a fairly high price. Lutus patted Marina on the head, saying it was all thanks to her mistake. They only recently discovered this, and although it was just an accident, she is still being recognized for her unexpected contribution. Rune, despite feeling annoyed with Marina, reminded her not to cause any more trouble and to memorize her magic before returning. On the way home, Lutus offered to teach Marina some fighting techniques to shorten the learning process. Rune heard this and started to feel jealous, so she asked him whether he liked Marina or her. Lutus, taken aback by the question, didn't reply, only feeling her face flush. Then Rune turned away, a slightly displeased expression on his face. But Lutus noticed that Rune was in a good mood, although he wouldn't dare say that all his decisions were right. If they were wrong, he would just have to live with them. One day, a soldier was seen traveling along the coast in a horse-drawn carriage. However, he encountered a giant, snarling, bloodthirsty wolf that craved human flesh. A few days later, at the Explorers Guild, a rumor spread about a nimble creature that attacked humans in the middle of the night. No one had ever seen the creature, only a dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. Meanwhile, Lutus noticed that Nor's mood had improved compared to before. Despite the widespread rumors, other explorers dismissed the story as unbelievable, given the lack of serious damage or loss. This rumor is spreading among merchants, causing the number of goods from Hoyan Fairway to gradually decrease. The feudal lord offered a reward of 500 del for this shadowy figure, leaving Lutus speechless. Hoping to earn some quick money, he decided to take on this mission with Eris's team. They needed more accommodation for the servants, including food and supplies. Therefore, to solve the housing problem, the team decided to take on this assignment. However, a few hours later, Rune sat with Lutus, drunk and upset that they didn't qualify for the mission. It seems only explorers ranked gold or higher are allowed to take on missions, while Lutus and Rune are still only bronze. Limiting large rewards to those with higher ranks makes sense, because high rewards often come with greater risks. The target may have used invisibility to conceal its true form, meaning it likely possesses intermediate-level magic abilities. However, Nor's group consisted entirely of top-tier explorers, so Lutus believed they would be fine. Nevertheless, he remained concerned about the creature's true purpose. If the goal was to prevent merchants from entering the city, then everything would be clearer. But for now, what the creature is looking for remains a mystery. Lutus suspected it was probably just trying to lure them into some kind of trap. It was time to begin the mission, so Lutus told Marina to gather all the servants. He wasn't aiming for a reward, but simply wanted to gain an overall understanding of the situation. Meanwhile, after hours of searching, Eris's team found nothing unusual. Lutus noticed this and considered expanding the search area, assuming the creature they were looking for was probably no longer near the Alpin area region. As he followed the path north, Lutus sensed a strange presence. He told himself he was no longer alone and ordered the creature to reveal itself, saying that there were no other humans around. At that moment, a giant black wolf, who identified himself as Avel, appeared and said that it had been a long time since they had last met. Avel explained that he came here because of Rune, but was disappointed to see her living among humans. Rune tells Avel that the emperor he once knew has been reborn in Lutus's body. Initially, Avel was skeptical, but Lutus showed him the emperor's mark on his palm to prove Rune's words were true. Lutus also confessed that he abandoned Avel 1,000 years ago and apologized for his actions, explaining that he only did so because he believed it was the best option at the time. He didn't ask for Avel's forgiveness. I only wish that he can find happiness. However, Avel unexpectedly launched an attack on Lutus's group, completely convinced that his master had been killed by humans. Fortunately, Rune managed to use a magical barrier in time to block the attack. However, Avel continued to attack Lutus, but he nimbly dodged and maintained a slight smile on his face. It was as if he were recalling the moment he first met Avel. Just before Avel was about to deliver the finishing blow, Lutus suddenly ran up and hugged him tightly, saying that he was so glad to see him still alive. This moment made Avel realize that Lutus was truly his master, and he accepted to return as his subordinate, affirming that it was a great honor. However, Rune couldn't accept this, believing Avel should be the one apologizing for his rude behavior. Lutus gently told her to calm down and consider it a simple welcome. Avel immediately mocked her, saying that he had no intention of replacing her as Lutus's maid. This made Rune blush with embarrassment. At this point, Avel mentioned emigration, which piqued Lutus's curiosity. When questioned, Avel explained that humans had recently begun settling in his area, so he had planned to find a new place to live in order to protect his people. However, unable to control his emotions, Avel apologized to Lutus for attacking him earlier. Rune remarked that Lutus had amassed a large following in a short period of time, to the point that his room had become cramped. Avel agreed and said that he knew of some ideal locations where Lutus could prepare new accommodations for his ever-growing number of subordinates. Additionally, Avel revealed that Vandal, an orc, had died of old age and he had attended his funeral. As for Arlong, Avel last saw him 500 years ago, but he could very well still be alive because he's a vampire. Avel explained that orcs only live slightly longer than humans, which saddened Lutus because he wouldn't have the chance to reunite with all his subordinates from his previous life. Avel then mentions Gilas, a giant ogre who once served Lutus. Currently, Gilas is in possession of Lutus's sword, so Avel suggests that Lutus should prioritize searching for Gilas. Lately, everything seems to be falling into chaos. Both humans and monsters are behaving strangely as if caught in an invisible storm. Avel had thought their world would be peaceful for the next 20 to 30 years, but things unexpectedly accelerated beyond all expectations. Lutus felt uneasy and suggested that everyone should be more careful. In the past, when he was emperor, he possessed a special sword. To forge magical weapons, one needs magicores, crystals containing magical energy. However, magicores only store a small amount of magical energy, so to create weapons with great power, a stronger energy source is needed. At that time, Lutus used a spell to imbue his sword with magical attributes. The result was a lightweight sword that possessed abundant magical power. With this sword, Lutus's magical power would be significantly increased, but he doesn't need it yet. However, upon reflection, he realized there was something unusual about the Goblin invasion. Despite having a chance of winning, their attack on a human city and the resulting heavy losses seemed illogical. If the situation is truly serious, Lutus needs to find his sword again. The next day, Lutus arrived at the palace. The princess looked at him with a serious expression and declared that she wanted to find the Holy Emperor's sword. The princess's original reason for coming to Elpin was to find that sword. Lutus's lost sword, which is now in Gilas's possession. Lutus pretended not to know much about it and asked the princess if the sword was famous. The princess explained that, according to legend, Emperor St. Lutus was a master swordsman. His sword is said to possess incredible historical value. This statement shocked Lutus deeply, as he was by no means a skilled swordsman. He asked again if she meant that he had once been a skilled sorcerer. The princess explained that, yes, Lutus they knew was an excellent sorcerer, but he was also widely known as a renowned swordsman. This was incredibly hard for Lutus to believe, because although he had taken some basic swordsmanship lessons, his skills were terrible. Hearing about such a far-fetched legend made him feel ridiculous. According to legend, he annihilated tens of thousands of people and monsters, both as emperor and as the strongest swordsman in the entire empire. Lutus covered her head with her hands, disgusted by the exaggerated myths about her. The princess's interest wasn't just in the sword itself, but primarily in the immense magical power it contained. Possessing this sword would allow her to unleash powerful, high-level spells. Lutus recalled that he had taught her many different types of magic, and she was a very quick learner. If she had enough magical power, she could certainly handle advanced spells. Lutus noticed that the princess seemed tired. He understood that she had tried very hard, but no matter how hard she tried, her magical power couldn't increase easily. Wanting to test her belief, he asked if she truly believed that the Emperor's sword lay somewhere in Elpin, or if it was all just a legend. The princess, after reading so many biographies about the Emperor, firmly asserted that she was 100% convinced the sword was not a myth. To expedite the search, she enlisted the help of adventurers by leaving a request at the Adventurers Guild. She promised that whoever found the sword would receive a reward of 30 del. However, the adventurers at the guild felt the reward was too low, making them uninterested in taking on the mission. They also found it absurd that the princess made a request based on a fairy tale about the Holy Emperor at Harrison Castle. Doubt still hangs over whether the 1,000-year-old sword still exists. Among the few who believed in the sword's existence, Lutus was one, and perhaps Eris was the only one else who shared that belief. Surprisingly, Nor turned out to be a loyal follower of Emperor Lutus. She revealed that her village possessed an ancient record, mentioning a servant of the emperor who had hidden the sword while fleeing the empire. The history of the founding of the Westburg nation also contained similar documentation, based on administrative records, further reinforcing the accuracy of the Holy Emperor's biography. Although the sword was made of iron, It had been magically enhanced, making it immune to environmental influences. This confirms that the sword may indeed be located somewhere in Elpin. However, most others were skeptical of Nor's theory. The 30 del reward was too low for them to be interested in, and even Arison Castle decided to ignore it. However, Lutus was tasked with finding the sword, accompanying Rune. He did this not only to verify the truth, but also because he wanted to see Gilas, his once loyal servant, to find out if he was still alive. Gilas was a member of the nearly immortal Cyclops clan, so Lutus believed he was still alive, even after a millennium had passed. However, Rune anxiously asked Lutus if they should change their clothes before meeting Gilas. "I'm afraid things will end in another battle like the one with Avel," Lutus reassured her, saying that even if Gilas were to get angry like Avel had, he is unlikely to resort to force under any circumstances. Lutus's memories returned to his time as a student at the Academy of Magic. One day, he and his classmates encountered Gilas, a fearsome Cyclops, and decided to attack him to drive him away. But surprisingly, Gilas didn't resist or show any aggression. Instead, he pulled out some rabbits and said he wanted to be friends. Gilas's nature was so gentle that he would never kill even an insect. His only food was fruit, despite being a giant Cyclops. For this reason, Lutus gave his sword to Gilas, believing that he would never use it to cause violence. Even after Lutus recounted this story, Rune warned Lutus that she would personally attack Gilas if he showed any rudeness towards Lutus. However, Gilas never intended to harm or kill anyone, and that is why Lutus chose him as her servant. Upon reaching the ruins where Gilas is believed to have lived, the gate was large enough for a Cyclops as massive as Gilas to pass through. This place, far from human settlements, is an ideal location to hide Lutus's sword. Although there were no signs of humans around, Lutus decided to use her presence detection skills to ensure her safety. He sensed that someone had been here before, and also discovered a strange magical power similar to Nor's. This made him wonder if she had been here before him. Nor knew a great deal about the Emperor, but Lutus doubted she would know about this place. Anyway, he didn't want them to find out, so he asked Rune to use his invisibility and camouflage skills. Rune hugged him from behind, saying that the disguise would be much easier when she was close to him. Later, they discovered footprints, which made Lutus realize that Nor must have formed a group with others, since Castle Arison had not accepted such requests before. They came across a huge rock, and Lutus thought this might be Nor's work. After some deduction, he realized that the footprints belonged to members of the guild. The people appeared to be fleeing from the monster. However, for some reason, Nor has been left behind. Suddenly, Lutus told Rune to remove his disguise and use his illuminating magic. Lutus could still sense Nor's magic, proving that she was still alive. They ventured deeper into the cave and found Nor unconscious on the ground. Lutus inquired about her condition and was relieved to learn that she had only fainted. Suddenly, a giant hammer slammed down onto the ground between them. Lutus realized this was the hammer he had given Gilas 1,000 years ago. He immediately realized that the monster attacking them was Gilas. He approached and was shocked to see that Gilas was no longer his former muscular self, but just a skeleton. At first, Lutus looked at Gilas in confusion, but after a while he realized that Gilas had used the immortality spell on himself. Gilas always valued Lutus and his subordinates more than himself. He found a cave and used a rock to block the entrance, determined not to abandon his main mission, so he used the immortality spell on himself, a spell possessed by Lutus's sword. In the past, Gilas was tasked with protecting the sword, so he prioritized that duty above all else. But that also meant he would die of starvation, unable to leave. Lutus looked at Gilas in disbelief, realizing that Gilas's rabbit-like structure was his fault. At that moment, Gilas attacked Rune, attempting to kill her. But before they could do that, Rune had already transformed for real. This made Gilas stop when he recognized her. While Gilas was distracted, Rune advised Lutus to kill him, as an undead monster like him could not return to his normal state. Lutus, not knowing what to do, looked down at the ground and gritted her teeth. Then he used divine light to incinerate Gilas. He ended his life. Lutus immediately regretted killing Gilas. I shed a few tears and felt sorry for his story. Lutus was prepared to sacrifice his own life if necessary, just so that his other subordinates could survive. However, he never considered the feelings of those who did not accept his decision. He wondered how Gilas must have felt knowing he would die alone in this dark cave. Meanwhile, Nor woke up and asked what they were doing there. Lutus and Rune explained that the people she had teamed up with had called for reinforcements. It helped her remember that she had been attacked by Gilas, the skeletal monster. The legendary sword they found disappointed Nor when she saw it, as she had expected it to contain more magical power. However, they decided to bring it back to the city as soon as possible. Finally, they left without realizing that the sword they were carrying was just a fake. The entrance was blocked, so Rune didn't think anyone would be here for long. Before leaving, they decided to stop for a while. Lost in thought, Lutus realized he was wrong. Ultimately, he never considered the feelings of his subordinates if they survived. For those who had sworn allegiance to him, they would probably have preferred to die rather than live. When Lutus was first reborn, he was only seeking freedom, but now he has changed. His goal is now to understand the lives of his servants. Rune understood this, and she exclaimed that she would accompany him on his journey. The following day, Lutus arrived at the palace, bringing the fake sword he had found to the princess. His old sword, the one they were searching for at Perulia's request, was actually a special sword with a touch of sophisticated magic. Lutus had made the sword capable of containing a large amount of magical power, and then transferring that power to its user. This sword was guarded by Gilas, a former servant of his. Gilas was so devoted that he made himself immortal just to fulfill that mission. Therefore, even if the princess requested it, Lutus couldn't simply give it to her. Instead, he created a fake sword to give to her. He copied the mana storage ability from the old sword into the fake one, ensuring she still received what she requested. The princess looked at the sword for a moment. Then Lutus suggested she try using some magic to test it. She decided to try using the sword to break a poisonous curse. The princess was delighted to see that the sword allowed her to perform a spell that she had previously been unable to do alone. This made Lutus realize that she was very talented, and he could trust that she wouldn't misuse the sword. Then Lutus bowed, informing the princess that his task was complete, as she was now able to use magic at this level. The princess acknowledged this and thanked him for all he had done for her. She teased him, saying she found him very attractive when he maintained such a calm demeanor. Then the princess gave him her payment. That evening, Lutus returned home to find his house filled with cute little girls, the slimes he had trained. They had just learned how to camouflage themselves. As Lutus entered, they all greeted him in unison. This made Rune yell at them to be quiet. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, and Avel entered dramatically, announcing that he had completed his mission. Avel went to find accommodation for these servants. After some searching, he discovered a place to the east, about half a day's journey away at his speed. Lutus stroked his chin, thinking that it wasn't so bad because at Avel's speed, half a day's journey was equivalent to 4 days for an average person. Lutus asked Avel to take him there immediately, and entrusted Rune with managing everything else until he returned. With those words, Lutus and Avel began their journey. As they traveled, Avel started a conversation, asking Lutus if he had found Gilas. Based on Lutus's body language, Avel realized that Gilas had been killed, however he did. This conversation made Lutus realize that she had been wrong to think that all her actions were for the benefit of everyone. He was so complacent that he didn't stop to think about how his decisions would hurt them. However, Avel did not blame Lutus. Avel explained that it was the servants who had left the sword for Gilas, and that they, not Lutus, were responsible for Gilas's lonely death. Lutus felt somewhat comforted and decided she would never abandon her servants again. With this decision, he fell asleep while Avel carried him to their destination. A few hours later they arrived, and Lutus found the area very beautiful. He thought there would be plenty of space to build houses and farms, as it was near a mountainous forest. Lutus wondered why such a wonderful place had remained untouched for so many years. Then he asked Avel if he knew anything about this, as he felt there was a deeper reason behind it. Unlike the eastern part of the continent where the empire once existed, the western part has many unexplored lands. After observing the surroundings, they discovered many places similar to this one, so it's possible this is a place awaiting human progress to develop. After hearing that, Lutus felt it was a reasonable explanation. Next, Avel introduced Lutus to the members of his pack, stating that they had sworn allegiance to him and would become his servants. Avel apologized for not having a larger pack, saying that given the current situation, he didn't think they could be of much help. Avel's pack consists of 18 hellhounds, which is equivalent to more than 100 people. Hellhounds rarely form packs and certainly don't bond with humans, which means that if they are willing to serve you, they have a great deal of trust in Avel. With this in mind, the entire pack became Lutus's servants. Lutus had called Loist and several other goblins to join the pack and help with the preparations, but for now, he thought it best to focus on preparing the food. Avel was curious about Lutus's next plan. Currently, Lutus only wants to focus on traveling the world. He not only finds excitement in exploring new places, but also thinks this might provide a better chance to reconnect with people he knew from his previous life. If they are willing to serve him again, he will offer them comfortable lodging. He told Avel to rest assured because he would no longer act like an emperor, as he had lost interest in the wars and politics of this world. Avel believed this was a wise decision because ever since his death, humanity has been waging one war after another. A little while later, they arrived at the lonely village, but Lutus told Avel to stop because he sensed something was amiss. They ventured further inside, stunned to find villagers lying on the floor. They stood at a distance, watching a group of men in robes harassing a young girl. Before they could act, the group stopped and began looking in their direction. This made Lutus wonder if they would be able to detect them. This surprised him, as he hadn't expected there to be people using mid-level magic in this area. Upon closer observation, Lutus realized they weren't human, but vampires. Noticing their presence, the two vampires ordered them to come out. Upon stepping out, they discovered that these were the two vampires who had caused this commotion. Lutus wasn't surprised by their power, as being able to use mid-level magic wasn't anything to be taken aback. He wondered what their purpose was. Even though they are vampires, they certainly don't need the blood of so many people to survive, which makes Lutus suspect that they might be trying to turn these people into their house elves. The two vampires laughed at Lutus's words. Then, staring at him, they said they only hunted people for entertainment. Lutus recognized this as a typical vampire response, making him realize that nothing had changed in the past 1,000 years. But then, with a sigh, Lutus asked them if they knew who Arlong was. Hearing this question, the two vampires were surprised, wondering how Lutus knew about Arlong. Their surprise quickly turned into anger, and they began summoning magic, preparing to kill Lutus. He wasn't surprised by this reaction at all. He ordered Avel to deal with the vampire on the left, but not to kill him, while he would handle the one on the right. Lutus and Avel easily overpowered the two vampires, nearly killing them. Lutus placed his sword against their faces, demanding that they show him where Arlong was, and if they did, he would spare them. He threatened them a little more, forcing them to agree to give him the information. But just before they could say anything, Lutus heard the sound of a carriage approaching. He wondered who they were, but knew he couldn't afford to be discovered. So he let the two vampires go, and instructed them to convey a message. Lutus has been reborn, and now it's time for these vampires to stop killing. After they left, Lutus saw that it was Princess Yulia and her guards. He realized that some of them had escaped and were seeking help from Elpin. Princess Yulia arrived and used her healing magic to heal the injured people. Lutus observed Princess Yulia, noticing that she was quite skilled with the sword. He walked away quietly, offering her a few words of encouragement. Arlong is the leader of a vampire clan. Vampires are generally proud of themselves, but Arlong is especially proud of being a vampire. His swordsmanship isn't exceptional, but it's not something to be ashamed of. Perhaps that's why Arlong was respected by everyone, including Lutus, who was even more skilled in magic than him. Arlong swore allegiance to Lutus even more so than to his own companions. But, on the other hand, it was Lutus's respect for Arlong that kept things stable, as Arlong never tried to hide his contempt for humanity. After his death, Arlong's promise never to harm humans was nullified. However, Lutus believed that Arlong would not be able to ignore him once he heard that he was still alive. That afternoon, Lutus went shopping with Rune. The bags became too heavy for them to carry, so Rune suggested they let the little slimes carry the supplies back with the help of Avel's pack of hunting dogs, who would act as bodyguards. Lutus was lost in thought again, realizing how wonderful it felt to have so many companions. However, finding enough food for everyone was a real challenge. While in the market, Marina happened to see a suit of armor. She immediately asked if she could buy it, but Rune refused, saying the armor was too expensive. Hearing Rune's tone, Lutus couldn't help but think she sounded like a real mother. Especially since Marina, a member of the group, wanted the armor so much that she tried to justify it by saying that with the armor, she would be able to support Lutus more in situations where magic couldn't be used. Rune found Marina's reasoning valid but remained firm in his refusal. Lutus thought it would be a waste of money to buy another set of armor, but then they thought they could make a suit of armor themselves. Due to a lack of money, Lutus believed that forging his own armor was the best option. Now, with his sword, he can use more magic than before. Therefore, he began to think about making armor out of steel, like the armor of castles. However, he realized that such armor would be too bulky and difficult to use. To improve it, he intended to make lighter armor but lacked the necessary materials. Lutus looked back at his ideas, realizing he was falling back into his old habit, over-preparing for every battle. There, Lutus decided to measure Marina's size to make armor, telling her to raise her arms. Then, he gently placed his hand on her chest to measure it, causing Marina to blush with embarrassment. The breastplates needed to be thick, but still flexible enough not to restrict movement, so they had to fit her body shape. After making a few adjustments, Lutus had completed a suit of armor that fit Marina perfectly. Although Marina was delighted, but Rune stood at a distance, feeling jealous because Lutus paid more attention to Marina. Now that Lutus was familiar with crafting armor, he no longer needed to touch or take measurements. He considered starting to build more weapons, but sensed sadness in Rune. However, Rune responded coldly, saying she was fine. Afterward, the group returned home. Lutus wasn't the type to enjoy fighting, so he put a lot of effort into his preparation. A well-prepared person can intimidate their opponent before the fight even begins. The next day, upon arriving at the Adventurers Guild, Lutus was surprised to find numerous requests to exterminate vampires. Lutus knew this would happen because vampires are powerful creatures, capable of using mid-level magic. They are vastly different in strength from the ordinary monsters around Elpin. The adventurers heard the news and concluded that this would be the end of Elpin. Some suggested fleeing, either to the capital or to the east. Suddenly, Castle spoke up, asking if he was the only one willing to fight. The number of knights and soldiers operating in Elpin has been drastically reduced after the goblin attack, meaning the only people the inhabitants can rely on are adventurers. Castle thought his words would motivate the others, but they just stood in the corner of the room, completely bewildered by Castle's failure. Eris approached and told the adventurers that they could only survive if they fought together. She said in a passionate tone that she wouldn't stop those who wanted to flee, but for those who wanted to fight, she suggested they work together to devise a strategy. And in that way, Eris succeeded in uniting everyone. Meanwhile, Lutus was curious about Nor's whereabouts. He returned to the Emperor's statue and found her there, gazing at it. Recognizing her, he approached her and asked if she had any connection to vampires. Lutus asked this question because he noticed something unusual about Nor's behavior. Normally, she would be the one to take the initiative and organize everything, but now she was silent. Hearing the question, Nor opened up and admitted that she was afraid of vampires. In fact, her homeland had been devastated by them. Her parents and everyone she knew were killed. She was the only survivor. At that time, she only survived because her mother hid her behind the statue of Lutus. To this day, she still vividly remembers the fire that destroyed her village, so every time she sees fire, it brings back memories of that day. After hearing this, Lutus suddenly remembered that she had indeed had a strange reaction to fire, but he didn't know that there was a story behind it. With all this in mind, Lutus extended her hand, inviting her to join the battle. She readily agreed as Lutus had helped calm her down. With a serious expression, Lutus knew he needed to stop the vampire invasion immediately, even if it means fighting to the bitter end with his former servant, Arlong. Eris and the others devised countermeasures against the vampire invasion. First, adventurers with gold rank or higher will form teams of at least 5 people. Then, silver and bronze rank adventurers will patrol the streets and city walls. If they spot enemies, they will not engage in combat, but instead call for assistance from higher-ranked teams. This was a simple strategy, and also the best thing Lutus could do. As a bronze-ranked adventurer, he should have been patrolling the area, but instead he decided to hunt down the vampires himself. With Avel's help, Avel ordered his wolf pack to report immediately if they detected any sign of vampires. Avel wondered if Arlong planned to disobey Lutus's orders. Lutus couldn't be sure if the vampires had delivered a message to Arlong, but they were clearly hostile, so he knew he had to stop them. When Marina arrived home, she met Avel for the first time and introduced herself. It was said that Rune had told him a lot about his past. Hearing this, Rune felt embarrassed. This caused her to spray some slime onto Marina's face. Rune had spent a lot of time with her spirits, so she had many good things to say about them. But out of pride, she didn't like saying it directly to the spirits. However, Avel informed Lutus that a group of vampires had been spotted moving north. Upon hearing this, Lutus told Rune and Marina to get ready because they would be heading there immediately. Upon arrival, they found about 12 vampires who were so confident they didn't even bother to hide themselves. Rune and Avel can each handle 2 vampires. So Lutus told them to go ahead and do it, and he would handle the rest. Rune led the attack, but the vampires quickly discovered her. They then used fire magic to attack her. But Rune is made of slime, which means she can't be killed. This caught the vampires by surprise. Before they could devise their next plan, Lutus used a vine spell to restrict their movement. The vampires were bound tightly. Confused by this magic, the vampires wondered how it could be, for they knew such magic had never existed. Lutus approached them saying that this magic didn't exist, as he had just created it at that moment. Recognizing Lutus's immense magical power, the vampires realized that this was Lutus, the one who had spared their lives the last time. He told them to pass the message on to Arlong, and as Lutus had predicted, the vampires had not yet delivered the message to Arlong. However, Lutus was willing to give them a third chance. He said he would spare their lives if they provided information about all the vampires in the surrounding area. But vampires aren't traitors, so they end their lives by biting themselves. Shocked by this, Lutus ordered Rune to knock out the remaining vampires before they could do the same. But it was too late. The pain vampires endure before death doesn't seem like they chose their own demise, leading Lutus to wonder if this was an order from Arlong himself. Upon examining the body, Rune realized that this was how they prevented information from leaking, ensuring everything was carefully concealed. Lutus apologized to Rune for the outcome, believing it was a consequence of his miscalculation. About a week later, they didn't encounter any more vampires. They had completely disappeared. Things became so quiet that even the wandering traders, those who feared vampires, began to return. And so Elpin gradually regained its lost hope. Lutus visited the Travelers Guild, only to find the travelers celebrating, which made him think they were starting to relax too much. Nor noticed Lutus's anxiety and explained that they couldn't help but celebrate. The threat from vampires had terrified both residents and travelers, so with their sudden absence, the townspeople simply wanted to enjoy the moment. While the others were celebrating, Nor led Lutus to a library where they could work to gather as much information as possible about vampires. Lutus wouldn't be of much help, because what he knows about them is outdated by about 1,000 years and limited to the Empire, but he can visualize the situation over the past century, giving them a better understanding of the current situation. Apparently, only nobles and those in the education field were allowed into the library, but since Nor had graduated from a prestigious magic school, they were easily granted permission to enter. The nobility and royalty disliked the idea of ordinary people receiving an education, which further convinced Lutus that the autocratic nature of the kingdom would probably never change. Lutus and Nor searched through several books only to discover news about all the bad things vampires had done in the past. Vampires have attacked many cities in the past, but only a few have been able to resist and repel them. Even when it seemed they had given up the attack, they changed tactics and attacked again. This could only mean that this quiet week was just a week of preparation for them, and they were far more cautious than any vampire Lutus had known before. He sat in silence, wondering what their next move would be. While flipping through some of Unwer's books, he stumbled upon it, a book filled with erotic artwork about itself. Nor realized Lutus had seen the books, immediately felt embarrassed, and hastily explained that it wasn't what he thought. Lutus wasn't one to judge, so he decided to ignore it and focus all his energy on defeating the vampire. He believed they hadn't given up, even though they were very skilled in magic, but there were only a few spells they could use. They could try to blow up or flood the city, but they are unlikely to attempt those options as it would consume too much of their mana. Only merchants, explorers, and followers of the Church of Lutus were allowed to enter and leave Elpin. Hearing this, Lutus had no doubt whatsoever. He was certain that vampires had infiltrated Elpin, disguised as followers of the church. After appearing several times, the vampires vanished without a trace. To this day, Lutus still doesn't understand why they did that. However, when he assumed that vampires had infiltrated Elpin, everything suddenly became clear. Their sole objective was to exploit these disguises, to penetrate deep into enemy territory. Then they seized the enemy's headquarters. Just as Lutus predicted, the believers entered the Palace of God. They may genuinely be believers simply asking for permission to travel, but this is not a mere coincidence. Lutus's retainers quickly arrived, informing him of their suspicions about the group of devotees who had just entered the palace, suggesting they might be a group of vampires. Avel immediately realized this and ordered them to stand still, ready to kill them if they were indeed vampires. The Lord's palace was heavily guarded, but Lutus did not want the guards to interfere in the battle. At that moment, Rune spoke up, saying she had a plan. On the day the devotees arrived at the palace, Lutus observed from a hidden corner, noticing something rather suspicious. They were all wearing hoods. Meanwhile, there were many guards surrounding the palace, and he didn't want to accidentally harm them with magic. Therefore, he was forced to rely on Rune's plan. According to the plan, the two slime henchmen stealthily blended into the crowd. They hurled insults at the nobles, causing the crowd to follow suit. The palace guards abandoned their posts and pursued the two men. This created an opportunity for Lutus to sneak into the palace undetected. He secretly followed them and decided to check if they were vampires, so he used an electric shock spell. Lutus was completely convinced that they were indeed vampires, just as he had suspected. However, these creatures seemed far more powerful than Lutus had imagined. The magic he used should have defeated them instantly. But it was almost completely ineffective. With no other choice, Lutus had to use holy light magic, attacking directly and killing them on the spot. Lutus had wanted to keep them to ask for more information, but now he had no other choice. Moving forward, he used his detection skills. I sensed a powerful source of magic emanating from a nearby room. He entered and discovered the vampires holding the Lord captive, forcing him to beg for forgiveness. Lutus was not surprised by this, as the Lord was the kind of man who frequented brothels, even during times of war. Princess Yulia was also captured and tied up in a corner of the room. The long-haired man was clearly the leader of the vampires. Lutus observed him for a moment, sensing something strange in his mana. Before doing anything to the princess, the leader called out Lutus' name, saying that he was aware of his presence. Lutus revealed himself, demanding that the leader reveal his name. The leader bowed and introduced himself as Bayer, a subordinate of Sir Arlong. Lutus had anticipated this, as he didn't think the king of the vampires would participate in a mission like this. Bayer spoke the language of the Empire, which indicated he knew about Arlong. Lutus stared at Bayer and asked where Arlong was. Because Sir Arlong is the king of vampires. Bayer replied that he couldn't easily reveal Arlong's location. Lutus was preparing to attack, prompting Bayer to order him to put down his weapon. Bayer stated that if Lutus wanted to talk, he would have to reveal his identity first. Lutus didn't want to show his face, but both the Lord and the princess were blindfolded, so this was a rare opportunity. He lowered his weapon, revealed his face, and asked Bayer if he felt more comfortable in this conversation. The vampires immediately attacked with dark magic, intending to assassinate Lutus. Lutus realized this and rubbed his head, because he knew dark magic wasn't his forte. The vampires fired at him, creating a massive fireball. Bayer smiled, thinking they might have gone a little too far, because although Lutus was rumored to be able to control dark magic, he felt that even with Lutus's abilities, this might still be beyond their tolerance. However, surprisingly, Lutus emerged from the smoke, controlling a dark magic orb, stating that dark magic wasn't really his forte, but he was still perfectly able to control it, even though it was his first time using it. Lutus chanted Held's Call, a supreme, super powerful magic spell, seizing Bayer from both sides. This magic neutralizes everything and devours only darkness. Once trapped, no one can escape, cannot die, but will only drift forever in the darkness, yearning for an end to this suffering. Bayer's eyes widened in astonishment, for he had never heard of such a dark magic. Lutus had never wanted anyone to use it, so he had never revealed anything about this magic. He was starting to lose patience, so he gave Bayer two options: tell him everything he knew, or drift in the shadows for the rest of his life. As expected, Bayer chose the first option, begging for mercy. Lutus brought him back to base, where he discovered that they hadn't been carrying out Arlong's orders. In fact, no one had seen Arlong for over 100 years, and even after his death, Arlong never issued a single command. Bayer and his group only attacked humans because they saw them as a tasty meal. At this point, Lutus realized that they had only done that because they thought it was what Arlong would want. These three vampires are named Bayer, Ruba, and Mark. Lutus demanded that they become his subordinates. Although Ruba's expression showed no approval of the idea, but they had no other choice, so they bowed their heads and agreed to become Lutus's servants. Lutus couldn't guarantee their loyalty, but they weren't strong enough to cause harm, so he decided to leave things as they were. Although this seemed sudden, Lutus looked at them and said that he had a mission for them. Avel looked on in confusion and asked Lutus why he had turned such an unreliable group into his subordinates. Lutus needed them to find Arlong for him. Currently, even the vampires don't know Arlong's whereabouts. However, they have a higher chance of finding him than Lutus, and once they do, they'll have no choice but to deliver Lutus's message. Meanwhile, Lutus made these vampires swear an oath, promising that if they broke their promise, their lives would be punished. This means that if they don't find Arlong, the Emperor's mark will kill them. Meanwhile, the Lord found himself kneeling before the statue of Lutus. He promised to change for the better because he was haunted by vampires and the reappearance of the long-lost Emperor. The people around him began hurling insults at him, demanding that he be like Princess Yulia. Lutus had wanted to make him do his job properly, but didn't think it would be so effective. Princess Yulia was still in shock from the Emperor's appearance. Instead of being afraid, she grew to love the Emperor even more, thinking that he had a very pleasant voice. However, Princess Yulia felt that she had heard that voice somewhere before. Lutus was now feeling relieved and relaxed, seeing that 2 days had passed without any incidents. At the same time, the servants had settled into their positions at the base, meaning he could now unwind a bit. Given the current situation, Lutus suggested organizing a party. And when they heard this, the servants cheered with joy. Lutus was surprised by their enthusiasm, initially wondering how they even knew what parties were. But he thought Rune must have explained it to them. At that moment, Eris and Castle entered with a pile of goods in their hands. They suggested Lutus should go shopping, because things at the market had become significantly cheaper. The Lord cut import taxes and fees in half, so everything became much cheaper. They were so cheap that Eris couldn't stop shopping, nor wondered what had prompted the Lord to make such a decision. She heard rumors that vampires had infiltrated the palace, and the one who saved him was Emperor Lutus. That encounter changed him and transformed him into a true lord. Nor felt this was good because now they could shop without any worries. However, she also reflected on the goblin and vampire attacks that had occurred, making her feel as if some unseen force had been protecting Elpin all this time. This thought excited her, as she believed the Emperor was a guardian angel who had bestowed guidance and protection upon Elpin. That evening, a vampire servant returned to report to his master. The scouts discovered that foreigners had been seen in one of the areas where they were planning to harvest. Queen Manaf asked if they had found Lutus yet. But they still hadn't found it, so they begged her for more time. After Lutus successfully repelled the vampires from Elpin, he and his servants all gathered at their new base. Unfortunately, he still hasn't been able to find Arlong's hiding place. He still needs time to bond with his new servants, as well as figure out how to establish a base. When all the hard times were over, they threw a party to celebrate. Lutus was worried about how his familiars would react to each other, but he was pleased to see them get along, which made him realize that appointing Avel as commander was the right decision. Loist unexpectedly approached Lutus, expressing his gratitude for accepting him as a subordinate. Lutus felt a little embarrassed, but replied that it was the least he could do, especially after having annihilated Loist's entire tribe. Loist told Lutus not to worry about it, because even if the goblins won the battle, they would have nowhere to go. Bates, after being driven from his homeland, had led the survivors south without a name. This piqued Lutus's curiosity, making her wonder why the goblins had attacked Elpin in the first place. According to Loist, it was all because of the demon army. This army was originally based in the north, but one day they unexpectedly moved south, causing them to lose their homeland. Meanwhile, Bates attacked human settlements in search of resources and land. But in recent years, they have started to expand, affecting many human settlements. Lutus reflected on everything that had happened, realizing that their new base was not secure. And in the worst-case scenario, they would have to face an army of demons. Rune, clearly intoxicated, heard them and immediately spoke up, saying they shouldn't be afraid of her. As the leader of the Mastema Knights, I will defeat the demon army if necessary. Avel, noticing Rune was drunk, reminded her that she was never in a leadership position, and even if she were the leader, she wouldn't last a year in that position. Rune, upon hearing this, became angry, and stated that the Mastema Knights were a group formed by Lutus familiars to keep each other under control, entirely their own creation, and had nothing to do with Lutus. Furthermore, Rune argued that Lutus was no longer the Emperor, so he didn't need a Knight Order. Even so, Avel still thought that having some kind of organization would be better. But he couldn't imagine anyone other than Fiore being the leader, a fallen angel and Lutus's most powerful familiar. Lutus thinks Fiore might still be alive and wonders what she's doing now. Lutus was impossible to guess what she was thinking. Even when the familiars argued, she would just smile and say nothing. And every time it was time to split into groups, she was always absent, probably because she was fed up with him. She was the only one of the familiars who could stand up to him in battle. Lutus believed that with her by their side, they would have a much better chance of fighting off the demon army. The next morning, Lutus woke up, but when he went outside, he heard a strange noise. Looking around, he spotted the Blackwing Warriors, an elite unit within the demon army. Lois tried to protect Lutus, but a demon ordered him to be quiet, and at the same time used magic to make him kneel down. He said that goblins are filthy creatures and should be quiet. Lutus easily broke the spell, saying he would deal with anyone who dared harm his comrades. The demons burst into laughter upon hearing Lutus's words, completely unaware of his true strength. A demon uses enchantment to seduce Lutus, but surprisingly the magic had no effect on him. Enraged, she ordered her army not to underestimate him, because he prevented one of her spells. She immediately unleashed a high-level magic skill, Dark Shot, confident that it would kill Lutus. However, Lutus didn't see it as a challenge. He raised his hand, easily blocking the magic, and sent it flying outwards, stunning the entire army of demons. At that moment, Queen Manaf proudly entered, eager to meet the man she believed to be the reincarnation of Emperor Lutus. Lutus immediately recognized her and felt she had made a mistake in searching for familiars, as Queen Manaf's attention had been drawn to her. Manaf explained that her army often used the land there to extract resources, so whenever they discovered people there, they forced them to leave. Lutus now understood why this area was uninhabited. The queen announced that she would allow them to use the land, but only on the condition that they did not wage war against each other. Meanwhile, Lutus reminded her of the Demon Pact, a non-aggression pact between the demon army and the Empire. Theoretically, his empire no longer existed, but it was the only thing he could think of to prevent a confrontation between the two sides. Queen Manaf, who once possessed power equal to Lutus's in the past, was someone Lutus knew he couldn't confront right now. Queen Manaf agreed with this, smiling broadly and saying she only wanted to scare Lutus a little because she didn't have time for pointless battles. She and her troops had acquired enough potentially valuable land to exploit, so they turned and left, promising to find another place. However, just as they were about to leave, the queen suddenly stopped, turned around and hurled a dark magic orb at Lutus and his familiars. It had been a long time since she'd remembered that it was humans who had first broken the treaty. Previously, everything was normal, but one day people came and took over the land without permission. Queen Manaf, spreading her wings, believed that those who could not keep their promises deserved punishment. Lutus realized the situation was truly very serious. When the dark magic spheres were launched, he used a special defensive spell to create a protective barrier. He told Queen Manaf to stop, asking her to because he only wanted to create a place where both monsters and humans could live freely. However, Queen Manaf did not believe that humans and monsters could live together peacefully, so she prepared to use powerful magic, ready to unleash a fatal blow. Lutus realized this was an extremely dangerous situation and began thinking of ways to escape this predicament. In his previous life, he and Manaf had fought for 3 days and 3 nights, but in his current state, he knew he couldn't possibly hold her off for even a few hours. He ordered Rune to lead everyone in retreat, but Rune resolutely refused, saying she couldn't leave him behind. Manaf reminded Lutus that it was because they had followed him that the land had been seized by humans. This is what caused many in her army to suffer immensely. After Lutus's empire collapsed, those who knew about the tree disappeared, and some of them decided to seize his land. Manaf believes that Lutus's innocence led to his betrayal and murder. She admits to having strong feelings for Lutus, and therefore cannot forgive the humans who killed him in the past. She never tried to exterminate humanity, knowing that it wouldn't bring him back, but now that he is alive, things are different. Manaf is determined to protect Lutus from those vile humans for the rest of her life. She didn't intend to kill him, but only wanted to mutilate his limbs so he couldn't escape. She was preparing to deliver the fatal blow. But before she could act, Rune rushed forward and handed Lutus something she didn't recognize. Rune's swift action melted Manaf's icy attack, preventing her from launching her own attack. Manaf wondered what Rune had given Lutus, but she didn't mind because she trusted in her own strength. She was so strong that she could overcome anything Lutus might throw at her. Suddenly, she could no longer sense Lutus's mana, not knowing where he was. He appeared right behind her, preparing to unleash his decisive blow. However, Manaf had anticipated this action, so she turned around and stabbed Lutus hard in the chest with her claws. Lutus, with a smile, took a candy from her pocket and offered it to her, telling her to lick it. The sweetness of the candy soothed her anger, unexpectedly changing her mood. Finally, Manaf decided to follow them back to base. There, Lutus and her allies prepared a lavish candy feast for her, which she thoroughly enjoyed. Manaf truly loves candy so much that she previously signed a pact with Lutus, simply because he gave her a piece of candy. Now that humans have become much more adept at making candy, Lutus suggests that Manaf should negotiate with humans instead of killing them. But she just thought it would be much easier to take over some human territory and make them pay with candy. Knowing he couldn't convince her, Lutus asked her what she really came here for. He sensed something was wrong, because reclaiming the territory should have been easy for her. Yet she hadn't done anything about it so far. He realized she intended to expand her territory southward, which was why she brought along the Blackwing Battle Axe army. These events led Lutus to believe that something was pursuing them to seize their territory. Manaf knew he had been discovered. Angrily biting into her candy, she opened up and shared her story. She said the creatures chasing her were called Legion, a group of giant zombies. Legion suddenly began putting pressure on the demon army in the north. Although they aren't strong, they are very troublesome due to their large numbers and cannot be killed because Legion are zombies. Manaf decided to move a little further south, not to invade anyone. Lutus understood this because it was Legion that had forced the demon army to move south, driving the Goblins out of their territory and causing them to attack Elpin. Manaf knew that someone was controlling Legion, but she couldn't figure out who was behind it. Upon hearing this, Lutus looked into Manaf's eyes and proposed a temporary agreement. Legion would certainly become a threat to them, so he thought they should cooperate to find the mastermind. The terms of the agreement stipulated that they would share any information they discovered and would not fight until their objective was achieved. Upon hearing this, the demons began to protest, hurling insults at Lutus, saying there was no reason why Manaf would agree to the deal with him. However, Manaf told them to shut up, then agreed to the deal. Knowing that Lutus would do his best to make her happy, she wouldn't fight him. While that wasn't guaranteed, she was willing to consider the idea. Because she couldn't convince the zombies, she knew that eliminating them as soon as possible was the most sensible option. Then she left, telling Lutus to let her know if she gathered any information. A few hours later, Lutus enjoyed a hot tub for the first time in a long time. While relaxing, he began thinking about how to destroy Legion. The number of zombies is enough to give even the demon army a headache, but controlling them will require an enormous amount of mana. Something even he, at the peak of his power, couldn't provide. This made him wonder if anyone as powerful as Manaf actually existed. There might be other mechanisms for controlling zombies that he's unaware of. He decided to go to the library later to learn more. Just then, Nell, one of Manaf's subordinates, walked in. She offered to help Lutus scrub her back. Lutus blushed and quickly refused, saying that she didn't need to do that, because she was merely a messenger sent by the queen. Nell refused to give up, saying that Manaf had ordered her to take good care of Lutus. She leaned in, trying to seduce Lutus, and it seemed to be working, even though she wasn't using any seduction magic. After a moment, Lutus regained his composure and firmly refused, saying he was fine. If she wanted help, she only needed to answer his questions. Lutus began to wonder why Rune, who was supposed to be guarding outside, had let Nell in. Nell replied that there was no one guarding the place when she entered. But in reality, Rune was lying unconscious on the floor outside, his last breaths coming in. Try to warn Lutus about the danger Nell poses. Meanwhile, Avel arrived at the hot springs and found Rune lying unconscious. Surprised and worried, he quickly helped Rune up. Then they both rushed to find Lutus, worried that he might be in danger. However, upon arriving, they were shocked to witness Nell clinging tightly to Lutus, trying to persuade him to look at her naked body. Nell, boasting about her smooth and youthful skin at the age of only about 100 years, began to brag, asking Lutus to touch it to feel it. Lutus, still confused by Nell's strange behavior, asked if Manaf ordered her to kidnap him. However, he was surprised to hear Nell reply that she loved him and wanted to be his wife. Rune, unable to control his anger, began hurling insults at Nell, calling her a lowly succubus. While the two of them were arguing fiercely, Lutus took the opportunity to ask Avel to help him get out of the hot spring. Finally, he escaped their harassment and is now sitting in the Elpin library, searching for information about Legion, the group of undead that attacked Manaf. However, for a moment, his mind wandered as he recalled the image of Nell, before being interrupted by Nor's arrival. She asked him if he had found anything interesting. Lutus, leaving Avel in charge of the base, decided to go to the library with Nor, hoping to gather useful information about Legion. But after flipping through numerous books, he realized there was no significant information. Not only was there no information about Legion, but even the history of the surrounding territories was vague, leading Lutus to realize that the country of Tirula was truly terrible at preserving historical records. The only story Lutus found even slightly interesting was the legend of the country's founding. In ancient times, the western regions were not under the control of any nation, but largely belonged to monsters. The people there were forced to live in darkness, constantly fearing attacks from them. Then one day, a man named Winterbolt appeared, claiming to be blessed by the gods. In his fight against monsters, Winterbolt defeated the rulers of the western continent. In his final battle, he annihilated an army of 100,000 with righteous fire. Following that victory, Winterbolt built a city, which is now known as Vestad. Lutus, however, felt the story was somewhat exaggerated, because he knew that defeating an army of 100,000 was no easy feat. Judging by Lutus's expression, Nor guessed that he hadn't found what he was looking for. She suggested that if he wanted more information, he should go to the library in Vestad. Lutus realized this was a good idea because Vestad was a larger city, meaning the chances of finding useful information would be higher. At the same time, he wanted to learn more about everything there, so this was like killing two birds with one stone. While he was wondering how to get to Vestad from here, Rostin, the princess's servant, happened to overhear and asked if he intended to go there. However, Lutus didn't want Rostin to go with him, so he lied, saying he wasn't planning to go to Vestad and was just daydreaming. He guessed that perhaps the princess had assigned another mission to the Adventurers Guild, but the reward was too low, so no one wanted to take it. Lutus, with his pockets dwindling from supporting his entire entourage, couldn't afford to waste time on such missions. He was about to leave immediately, but before he could step out the door, Rostin called him back, informing him that the princess needed to return to Vestad. However, no one in the Adventurers Guild was willing to act as her escort, so they didn't have enough people to accompany her. Hearing this, Lutus thought to himself, "This is exactly as I suspected. Could I have predicted any more?" He recalled that when the princess had passed through Elpin before, they had been fully escorted. So he wondered why there were fewer guards this time. Rostin didn't elaborate, only saying there was a reason for it. The following day, the princess smiled brightly when she saw Lutus come to see her. He agreed to be an escort for the trip, but only because he knew that the purpose was to bring the sick to receive treatment. The princess tried to heal them with the magic he had taught her, but it wasn't enough. Just then, one of the patients coughed up blood, causing Yulia to rush over to treat him. Lutus believed that the princess must have saved many people, as she was becoming increasingly proficient in healing magic. However, he also noticed that she didn't hesitate to ask for help from others, which clearly demonstrated the qualities of a good leader. Her intentions in this mission were completely pure, which made Lutus feel a little guilty for not wanting to help in the first place. Nell, noticing that Lutus had been staring at the princess for a long time, asked him if he had feelings for her. Lutus denied it, but Nell's keen eyes told him otherwise. He insisted there was nothing between them. And nothing could possibly happen since she's a royal princess and he's just an ordinary adventurer. Just then, Rune appeared, saw Nell bothering Lutus and shouted, telling her to stay away from him. Furthermore, since they were in a public place, Rune reminded Nell to hide her horns so that no one would notice. Nell just laughed, replying that she had used illusion magic to conceal them. While the two girls argued about Lutus, Nor began to think that Lutus was actually quite popular with women in the current circumstances. Faced with this situation, Lutus was forced to explain to Nor that Rune, Marina, and the others were all from his village. However, Lutus wasn't sure how long he could keep that lie. He never thought Nor would take on this escort assignment, especially with such low pay. But her main goal in becoming an adventurer was to help people, so she didn't mind at all. Although this wasn't widely publicized, the royal family wasn't very popular with the people. However, the princess always cared about the lives of the people, which is why Lutus decided to go out and help her complete this task. By the second day of their journey from Elpin to Vestad, fortunately they had not encountered any problems. However, Rune and Nell kept arguing, preventing Lutus from getting any sleep. Eventually, he gave up and stopped interfering in their quarrel. When the sun set, they set up a small camp away from the main road. While Nor was enjoying the tea that Marina had brewed, she began asking Marina about Lutus's village. Hearing this, Lutus immediately rushed in, trying to give an answer that wouldn't arouse Nor's suspicion. He quickly tried to change the subject, asking Nor if she knew when they would arrive in Vestad. Nor replied that the journey would take about 3.5 more days. Princess Yulia unexpectedly walked in, asking for some of the delicious tea that Marina had just brewed. While sitting there, she thanked Lutus and Nor for taking on such a troublesome job, despite the low pay. This journey reminded Nor of the exploits of Emperor Lutus, which she had read about in a history book about the great emperor. Princess Yulia agreed, but personally, she preferred the story of Lutus standardizing the healthcare system. He sent his attendants to every territory to treat the people there. Nor and Princess Yulia unexpectedly became close when they realized they were both fans of the Empire's history. They had seen each other a few times at the library, but Yulia was still surprised to meet someone like Nor who regularly borrowed books about the Emperor. Lutus began to feel uncomfortable listening to their lively discussions about her past, so he decided to leave, feeling a little strange that his life was being recorded and celebrated so much. But at least he was glad that the two of them seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the story. The fact that people worshipped him as a god in the past only proves how poorly his successors have done, plunging the continent into its current chaos. People cling to the image of the wise emperor as their last hope. Meanwhile, Nor and Yulia realized they had been talking for too long, so they decided to end their discussion. But before leaving, Nor told Yulia that the world would be a much better place if Emperor Lutus were still alive. Yulia heard this and her mood suddenly changed. However, she wasn't upset because she knew it was true. Under his reign, the poor were neglected, and the nobles were only concerned with their own status. Then Yulia quietly left, knowing that she had to stop her brother, Royak, if she truly wanted to become a ruler like Emperor Lutus. That night, Lutus tossed and turned, wondering if Yulia was all right, because he had noticed she seemed worried about something earlier. Not long after, he decided to go to bed, reminding himself that he had sworn not to get involved in politics. But suddenly his body jolted, a sensation signaling that he had detected the presence of a monster nearby. He sensed a massive number, estimating around 100 monsters surrounding the group. Lutus immediately recognized that these monsters belonged to the Legion, the undead group Manaf had mentioned earlier. Nell suggested they flee, leaving the civilians behind, because she knew the Legion would attack brutally and indiscriminately. Lutus thought for a moment and decided to scout the situation first. He told Nell to go with him, while Rune stayed behind to keep watch. As she left, Nell noticed that everyone seemed to admire Lutus, and remarked that perhaps it was the Emperor's charisma that commanded such respect. However, Lutus didn't think he deserved the praise. He said that his charisma was nothing compared to Manaf's. Manaf was quite easygoing and agreeable, to the point that the demon army didn't feel like an army at all. Normally, monsters don't tend to congregate and build settlements. But the Legion was very different. They attacked human communities but took nothing like food, and when they were done, they simply left without a trace. This led Lutus to believe that the Legion had a certain structure. It's strange that such a large group could gather together so naturally. The only explanation could be that someone is resurrecting them and controlling them with an extremely powerful magical force. The fire magic that the nation's founder, Winterbolt, used to destroy an army also had similar characteristics. It wasn't something an ordinary human being could do. Lutus wondered if there might be a connection between Winterbolt and this event. Soon after, the Corps appeared, fully equipped and ready for battle. Without wasting any time, they dismounted and launched an attack. Lutus surmised that these creatures lacked independent consciousness and were simply being manipulated. The magic he needed to use would take some time, so he asked Nell to persevere and fight them until he finished. The Legion began its attack, but Nell used both her strength and magic to hold them back, buying enough time for Lutus to complete her spell. In an instant, his magic annihilated the entire army. Nell saw this and was impressed by Lutus's strength. But he replied that it was all thanks to her for helping him buy enough time to recite the prayers. In reality, Lutus lied about being weak. He just wanted to see how she would react if she thought he was incapable of defending himself. She passed the test, proving that she had no intention of harming them. Lutus intended to tell Rune about this because, under normal circumstances, the monster army couldn't use holy magic, making the undead a very troublesome threat. However, now that Lutus was on the team, possessing this type of magic, they could fight them with ease. However, using this magic is very difficult for Lutus, which means that if he has to use it constantly, they will be in trouble. Knowing that allowing the Legion to exist was too dangerous, he needed to find out who was behind them. The group arrived in Vestad without further trouble and took the patients to the temple hospital. While there, Lutus was very impressed with the quality of the magical treatments at the temple. And he was even more shocked to realize that Vestad was much bigger than he had imagined. The city walls were twice as high as those of Elpin, completely obscuring the surrounding mountain range. However, Lutus did not believe that this could be achieved through individual effort alone. Therefore, he believed that there must be someone with magical powers equal to this. Princess Yulia entered and thanked Lutus once again for accompanying them here. Lutus humbly replied that he was just doing his job. Yulia said she would send his reward to his place later, but before that she wanted to talk to him. Their conversation was interrupted by a group of soldiers demanding that everyone make way because Prince Royak was approaching. Royak is Yulia's older brother, so he stopped in front of her, acknowledging her presence. He had just heard she was in Elpin, and now she was in Vestad. He couldn't help but wonder. Yulia smiled and explained that she had previously gone to Elpin to complete some procedures, and now that she was finished, she was returning to Vestad, bringing some injured patients to the temple hospital. Upon hearing this, Royak concluded that it was all a waste of time. He argued that the royal family was only interested in power, and that medical treatment should be left to the priests. He considered Emperor Lutus a coward and even blamed him for Yulia's attitude, saying she should learn from her ancestor, Winterbolt. Yulia bowed her head, her face filled with sadness. Lutus realized that Yulia didn't have much power in the royal family, but he didn't expect the treatment she received to be so terrible. Just then, a man wearing a hood stepped out from the crowd. He grabbed a knife and lunged towards Princess Yulia, intending to kill her. Lutus didn't want to get involved and intended to let Rostin handle it, but within seconds he realized that Rostin wouldn't arrive in time, so he had no choice but to use magic on these people. He quickly disarmed the attacker. After doing so, Lutus worried that Ryoak would recognize him, as he didn't have time to conceal his magic. Ryoak ordered his soldiers to tie them up and dispose of them immediately. The man protested, telling Ryoak that he was only following someone else's orders. But before he could finish his sentence, the soldiers beheaded him, blood splattering everywhere, even onto Yulia's face. Then, Ryoak smiled at Yulia and suggested she return to Elpin because the city had become quite dangerous lately. Yulia collapsed to the ground in shock. Lutus watched from a distance, wondering if Ryoak had hired that villager to assassinate her. That evening, Lutus visited the princess in her room. She apologized for causing him worry. She said that even though she had prepared herself mentally, she froze when it actually happened. This statement surprised Lutus, and the princess explained that she had anticipated an assassination attempt taking place right in the middle of the town square. The current king's health is failing, leading to a struggle for the throne. She is the only princess in the royal family, and because she cannot effectively use her mark, she becomes an ideal target. Ryoak wanted to prove that he was so ruthless that he wouldn't forgive anyone, not even his own sister. That has always been the nature of this country. Nevertheless, she apologized for making the atmosphere tense and decided to go to sleep, but asked Lutus to stay with her for a little while until she fell asleep. Lutus kept his promise, sitting beside her while she slept. Meanwhile, he realized that it was no surprise that the heirs to the throne would try to kill each other. This brings back unpleasant memories. He reminded him of his vow not to interfere in politics. Just then, Rune suddenly burst into the room calling for Lutus. He stepped out into the hallway where he encountered Arlong again, wearing a hood. Lutus sent his vampire minions throughout Elpin to search for him, and they found him faster than he had anticipated. Lutus began speaking to Arlong, but before she could clarify her purpose, Arlong knelt down and apologized, and admitted that he had no knowledge of his subordinates attacking people. He intended to end his own life, but Lutus stopped him at the last minute. Upon seeing Arlong's wrinkled, weathered face, vampires may be immortal, but they still age if they lack human blood. Arlong was once a proud vampire, and Lutus imagined how humiliated he must have been to witness himself being reduced to this level. Determined to fix things, Lutus cut his wrists. He gave his blood to Arlong to drink. He felt responsible for Arlong's current situation, and this was the only way to atone for his mistakes. Without saying much, Arlong drank the cup of blood and began to change. With just that cup of blood, Arlong regained his former proud appearance, but his body was left completely naked. Rune and Marina were somewhat taken aback by Arlong's body in that state, so they asked him to put some clothes on. Once Arlong was fully recovered, Lutus's forces grew once again. At that moment, Lutus was simply overjoyed to be reunited with an old friend. He couldn't imagine what would happen next. Meanwhile, Manaf had just received important information from one of her servants, and to fulfill the covenant they had agreed upon, she ordered her servant to inform Lutus of this. Manaf had a bad feeling about this, fearing that the person controlling the zombies might be an old friend. Finally, Lutus found Arlong and brought him back as his subordinate. To celebrate Arlong's return, they threw a grand party. During this time, they searched for information about the Undead group, but everyone, including Arlong, had no news. When Lutus died, Arlong lost his way and never truly emerged from the shadows. He grew weaker and weaker, losing interest in the outside world. Lutus felt guilty about this, as he had pushed Arlong away and left him with vague orders. However, Arlong informed Lutus that he had lost too much power, not just because of the orders Lutus had given him. After Lutus' death, Arlong lost all purpose in life. Therefore, he just wanted to die slowly and put an end to everything. He should have realized that one day they would have to part ways since he was immortal and Lutus was human. But instead, he blamed himself. Nevertheless, he swore to serve Lutus with all his remaining strength. Just then, Avel walked in. He informed Lutus that there was an urgent report and that they needed to discuss it privately. Lutus and Avel travel to a secluded area where information is revealed that one of the Demon Queen's subordinates visited their base today. They discover a zombie summoning site in the northern Wretch Mountains, and there they found a shocking object, an angel feather lying right in the middle of the summoning circle. Lutus was astonished to discover this because he knew that angels only existed in the kingdom of heaven. This led him to speculate that the feather belonged to his fallen angel, Fiore. Back at base, Arlong was surprised to see that Lutus had amassed so many followers in such a short time in Elpin. Avel apologized for acting without orders. But he sensed that Lutus definitely wanted to hear this news as soon as possible. Lutus agreed, suggesting they discuss it with everyone. He convened a meeting where the rest were surprised to hear that Fiore might be in control of all the undead. Lutus asked them to calm down, saying they weren't sure about this yet. However, Fiore is an immortal angel, and also strong enough to contend with him at his peak. With the feather they found in the north, it would be strange not to suspect her. This shocked everyone because they couldn't understand why Fiore would want to control the undead. At this point, Arlong spoke up, saying he had something to share. 500 years ago, he received a letter from Fiore, which stated that she had no intention of leaving her hiding place anytime soon. The letter stated that she wanted to collaborate with him and asked him to come to the Wrecked Mountains in the north. The Wrecked Mountains were where they found the feather, making Lutus almost certain that Fiore was responsible for everything. At that time, Fiore always smiled and treated everyone kindly, so Arlong didn't think she would harm anyone in the group. However, Avel disagreed. He believed that someone as strong as Fiore would surely realize that Lutus was still alive. Therefore, the fact that she never came to see him could indicate that she had turned her back on him. As accusations began to spread, Lutus asked everyone to calm down, saying that Fiore was just a suspect, so they couldn't definitively say she was behind it all. If she's really still alive, he thinks the first thing they should do is try to contact her. Lutus assigned Avel the task of finding Fiore, while the rest went to the library to gather more information. Whether Fiore is behind this or not, they can't do anything without finding her, and information is their most valuable asset. About an hour later, they arrived at the library but were denied entry, because Prince Royak has restricted access to it. This was a major obstacle to Lutus's plan, so he considered using magic to break through the gate, but he soon realized that doing so would cause many problems if they discovered him. He decided to ask Yulia about this matter since she was royal and might be able to help. He came to see her and informed her of the current situation. Yulia was surprised that Royak would do this, but she couldn't help Lutus, even though they were both royalty. Royak was the main candidate for the throne, meaning Yulia had virtually no power left. However, she knew why Royak had closed the library. She explained to Lutus that Royak was searching for a magical weapon, hidden in a labyrinth beneath the city. To explain further, she recounted the story of Winterbolt. Winterbolt was blessed by the gods and burned an entire army to ashes. However, there is a popular theory that Winterbolt was not powerful enough to perform those spells on his own. Instead, he is said to have created a magical weapon capable of amplifying the user's magical power tenfold, allowing them to perform extremely powerful spells. This weapon is rumored to be hidden somewhere beneath Vestad. Ryuak was determined to find this weapon to gain enough power to fight the Eastern nations. In short, he restricted access to the library to ensure no one could find the weapon before him. Hearing this, Lutus understood the situation, because magical items grow larger depending on the amount of mana they contain. If Winterbolt used a weapon as large as an entire city, everything now makes sense for Lutus. With such a powerful weapon, controlling an army of undead is entirely possible, even for someone who isn't exceptionally strong. At the end of the conversation, Yulia asked Lutus to help her search for the weapon. Lutus had originally intended to investigate it alone, but he still asked the princess why she wanted to find it. Yulia admitted that she lied when she said she wanted to be like Emperor Lutus. In reality, the Emperor was simply someone she admired. She realized that the Emperor had also been ridiculed just like herself, so she escaped her own helplessness by immersing herself in stories about him. Over time, the only thing Yulia became certain of was that this country needed to change, and she believed that only she could make it happen. That's why she needed to find a weapon before Ryuak, to prevent him from causing any more chaos. Lutus is the only person Yulia trusts, which is why she asked him to join her on this journey. Initially, she thought she would feel stressed after the assassination attempt, but the reality was quite the opposite. After some thought, Lutus realized he wouldn't find much information in the library, so the best plan was to stick to Yulia's plan. After a while, he admitted that he was trying to justify himself, because there was actually something about Yulia that made him want to help her. Despite knowing the journey would be fraught with risks, he shook Yulia's hand and agreed to join her in the search for the magical weapon. Hoping to unravel the mystery of the undead army, a group of undead began approaching from the north. Their first instinct was to enter the labyrinth beneath Vestad to search for clues. This place is believed to be a hiding place for powerful magical weapons, possibly used to create an army of undead. Rune had prepared a large bag for the maze, but now she thinks she might have prepared too much. She explained that she had packed enough food and water in case they got stranded somewhere. By this time, the place was already full of poor people and felt like a slum, but now it resembles a real prison. Upon reaching a certain point, they were surprised to discover just how vast the labyrinth was. Lutus noticed something strange about the wall. He immediately placed his hand on it and discovered a giant magic circle. This magic circle was set up to redirect mana to another location. The more Lutus thought about it, the more confused she became about why this place was created. A place like this can only be created if you have a large amount of mana, like Lutus or Manaf. However, if you already have enough mana, why bother creating it in the first place? Lutus was confused, wondering what Winterbolt was thinking when he created this place. Meanwhile, Nell noticed that Arlong wasn't with them, and asked Lutus why. It turned out that Lutus had given Arlong a different mission. She asked Arlong to transform into her and protect the princess while he was away. Even the royal palace was no longer safe for her, and Lutus trusted that Arlong would be able to maintain his disguise without being discovered. At that moment, they heard footsteps approaching. Rune and Marina were startled, thinking it was a horde of undead approaching. But it turned out they were just two ordinary people, seemingly being chased by something. As they stepped out, they let out a warning cry, signaling to everyone that the horde of skeletons was approaching. Lutus, his face covered in sweat from anxiety, found this quite advantageous, as he hadn't expected this place to be connected to Legion. Thinking this, he told the other group to continue on their way, while they stayed behind to block the horde of skeletons. They ventured deeper into the cave, where Lutus spotted a small army of skeletons, equipped similarly to the Legion. During the battle, Lutus didn't even need to fight because Nell and Rune dealt with everything in seconds. This made Lutus realize that Legion only truly posed a significant threat when fighting in large numbers. At this moment, Lutus looked around and spotted a strange pillar, wondering if this was what had created the horde of undead. He guessed that the magic on the pillar was called resurrection, something only Winterbolt could use. With that hypothesis in mind, Lutus wondered if it was just a coincidence that they found Fiore's feathers in the north. Nell came up with an idea, suggesting that Fiore was actually Winterbolt, but Rune overheard and immediately objected, because she didn't think Fiore was that kind of person. Nell reiterated that they didn't actually know who Winterbolt was, and she thought Fiore was more likely to be him, given his powerful mana, comparable to that of the Demon Queen. Lutus, aware of that possibility, suggested they continue exploring the place in the hope of finding something interesting. As they continued moving, Lutus reflected, remembering that he had once considered the possibility that Winterbolt was Fiore. However, Lutus knew that Fiore possessed such a vast amount of mana that she didn't need a magical weapon like this. He also realized that Fiore might have other reasons for doing so. As they ventured deeper, they spent most of their time eliminating the undead they encountered. They had gone quite far, and Lutus realized that his servants were nearing their limit. A while later, they arrived at an arena, the place where Lutus sensed someone's presence. He gestured for everyone to stop for a moment, then looked ahead. This is where Prince Royak, who once tried to assassinate Yulia, was present. Royak was frustrated that he couldn't open a gate. This only reinforced Lutus's belief that there must be something important inside. Rune, standing in the arena, could sense that Royak was quite weak, making them wonder how he could have come this far. Finally, Royak managed to open the gate, allow Lutus and the others to enter. Although Royak was just an arrogant nobleman, they still had to be wary of him. But at least this confirmed that he was looking for Winterbolt's weapon. They approached the platform where Royak was standing, where there was an ordinary magic lock. Based on what Royak had just said, Lutus realized that this lock only reacted to royal blood, meaning only descendants of Winterbolt could open it. This made him wonder if he needed to bring Yulia here. Anyway, this was a dead end for them, so Lutus suggested they return to solid ground. Upon returning, Lutus informed the group that he would be swapping places with Arlong and meeting Yulia. He told them to return without waiting for him. Lutus planned to just report the progress to Yulia and see how she reacted. He knew that leading her to the arena would be difficult, but he was sure she would agree without much thought. Lutus knocked on Yulia's door, but surprisingly, she opened the door with an irritated expression, saying she didn't want to talk to him right now. Then she slammed the door in Lutus's face.